Section 11 of Howard Pyle's Book of Pirates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barry Eads. Howard Pyle's Book of Pirates by Howard Pyle. Compiled by Merle Johnson. Jack Ballister's Fortunes, Part 2. Early in the morning, perhaps 8 o'clock, Lieutenant Maynard sent a boat from the schooner over to the settlement, which lay some 4 or 5 miles distant. A number of men stood lounging on the landing, watching the approach of the boat. The men rowed up close to the wharf, and there lay upon their oars, while the boatswain of the schooner, who was in command of the boat, stood up and asked if there was any man there who could pilot them over the shoals. Nobody answered, but all stared stupidly at him. After a while one of the men at last took his pipe out of his mouth. "There bean't any pilot here, master," said he. "We bean't pilots." "Why, what a story you do tell!" roared the boatswain. "D'ye suppose I've never been down here before, not to know that every man about here knows the passes of the shoals?" The fellow still held his pipe in his hand. He looked at another one of the men. "Do you know the passes in over the shoals, Jim?" said he. The man to whom he spoke was a young fellow with long, shaggy, sunburnt hair hanging over his eyes in an unkempt mass. He shook his head, grunting. "Nay, I don't know nought about t' shoals." "'Tis Lieutenant Maynard of His Majesty's Navy in command of them vessels out there," said the boatswain. "He'll give any man £5 to pilot him in." The men on the wharf looked at one another, but still no one spoke, and the boatswain stood looking at them. He saw that they did not choose to answer him. "Why," he said, "I believe you've not got right wits. That's what I believe is the matter with you. Pull me up to the landing, men, and I'll go ashore and see if I can find anybody that's willing to make £5 for such a little bit of piloting as that." After the boatswain had gone ashore, the loungers still stood on the wharf, looking down into the boat, and began talking to one another for the men below to hear them. "They're coming in," said one, "to blow poor Blackbeard out of the water." "Aye," said another. "He's so peaceable, too, he is. He'll just lay still and let 'em blow and blow, he will." "There's a young fellow there," said another of the men. "He don't look fit to die yet, he don't. Why, I wouldn't be in his place for £1,000. I do suppose Blackbeard's so afraid he don't know how to see," said the first speaker. At last one of the men in the boat stood up. "Maybe he don't know how to see," said he, "but maybe we'll blow some daylight into him afore we get through with him." Some more of the settlers had come out from the shore to the end of the wharf, and there was now quite a crowd gathering there, all looking at the men in the boat. "What do them Virginia baccy eaters do down here in Caroliny anyway?" said one of the newcomers. "They've got no call to be down here in North Caroliny waters." "Maybe you can keep us away from coming, and maybe you can't," said a voice from the boat. "Why," answered the man on the wharf, "we could keep you away easy enough, but you bean't worth the trouble, and that's the truth." There was a heavy iron bolt lying near the edge of the landing. One of the men upon the wharf slyly thrust it out with the end of his foot. It hung for a moment, and then fell into the boat with a crash. "What d'ye mean by that?" roared the man in charge of the boat. "What d'ye mean, ye villains? D'ye mean to stave a hole in us?" "Why," said the man who had pushed it, "you saw 'twasn't done on purpose, didn't you?" "Well, you try it again, and somebody'll get hurt," said the man in the boat, showing the butt end of his pistol. The men on the wharf began laughing. Just then the boatswain came down from the settlement again and out along the landing. The threatened turbulence quieted as he approached, and the crowd moved sullenly aside to let him pass. He did not bring any pilot with him, and he jumped down into the stern of the boat, saying briefly, "Push off." The crowd of loungers stood looking after them as they rowed away, and when the boat was some distance from the landing, they burst out into a volley of derisive yells. "The villains!" said the boatswain. "They are all in league together. They wouldn't even let me go up into the settlement to look for a pilot." The lieutenant and his sailing master stood watching the boat as it approached. "Couldn't you then get a pilot, Baldwin?" said Mr. Maynard, as the boatswain scrambled aboard. "No, I couldn't, sir," said the man. "Either they all banded together, or else they're all afraid of the villains. They wouldn't even let me go up into the settlement to find one." "Well, then," said Mr. Maynard, "we'll make shift to work in as best we may by ourselves. 'Twill be high tide against 1 o'clock. We'll run in then with sail as far as we can, and then we'll send you ahead with the boat to sound for a pass, and we'll follow with the sweeps. You know the waters pretty well, you say." "They were saying ashore that the villain hath 40 men aboard," said the boatswain. [Footnote: The pirate captain had really only 25 men aboard of his sloop at the time of the battle.] Lieutenant Maynard's force consisted of 35 men in the schooner and 25 men in the sloop. He carried neither cannons nor carronades, and neither of his vessels was very well fitted for the purpose for which they were designed. The schooner, which he himself commanded, offered almost no protection to the crew. The rail was not more than a foot high in the waist, and the men on the deck were almost entirely exposed. The rail of the sloop was perhaps a little higher, but it, too, was hardly better adapted for fighting. Indeed, the lieutenant depended more upon the moral force of official authority to overawe the pirates than upon any real force of arms or men. He never believed, until the very last moment, that the pirates would show any real fight. It is very possible that they might not have done so had they not thought that the lieutenant had actually no legal right supporting him in his attack upon them in North Carolina waters. It was about noon when anchor was hoisted, and, with the schooner leading, both vessels ran slowly in before a light wind that had begun to blow toward midday. In each vessel a man stood in the bows, sounding continually with lead and line. As they slowly opened up the harbor within the inlet, they could see the pirate sloop lying about 3 miles away. There was a boat just putting off from it to the shore. The lieutenant and his sailing master stood together on the roof of the cabin deck house. The sailing master held a glass to his eye. "She carries a long gun, sir," he said, "and 4 carronades. She'll be hard to beat, sir, I do suppose, armed as we are with only light arms for close fighting." The lieutenant laughed. "Why, Brooks," he said, "you seem to think forever of these men showing fight. You don't know them as I know them. They have a deal of bluster and make a deal of noise, but when you seize them and hold them with a strong hand there's naught of fight left in them. 'Tis like enough there'll not be so much as a musket fired to day. I've had to do with 'em often enough before to know my gentlemen well by this time." Nor, as was said, was it until the very last that the lieutenant could be brought to believe that the pirates had any stomach for a fight. The 2 vessels had reached perhaps within a mile of the pirate sloop before they found the water too shallow to venture any farther with the sail. It was then that the boat was lowered as the lieutenant had planned, and the boatswain went ahead to sound, the 2 vessels, with their sails still hoisted but empty of wind, pulling in after with sweeps. The pirate had also hoisted sail, but lay as though waiting for the approach of the schooner and the sloop. The boat in which the boatswain was sounding had run in a considerable distance ahead of the 2 vessels, which were gradually creeping up with the sweeps until they had reached to within less than half a mile of the pirates. The boat with the boatswain may be a quarter of a mile closer. Suddenly there was a puff of smoke from the pirate sloop, and then another and another, and the next moment there came the 3 reports of muskets up the wind. "By zounds!" said the lieutenant, "I do believe they're firing on the boat." And then he saw the boat turn and begin pulling toward them. The boat with the boatswain aboard came rowing rapidly. Again there were 3 or 4 puffs of smoke and 3 or 4 subsequent reports from the distant vessel. Then in a little while the boat was alongside and the boatswain came scrambling aboard. "Never mind hoisting the boat," said the lieutenant. "We'll just take her in tow. Come aboard as quick as you can." Then turning to the sailing master, "Well, Brooks, you'll have to do the best you can to get in over the shoals under half sail." "But, sir," said the master, "we'll be sure to run aground." "Very well, sir," said the lieutenant, "you heard my orders. If we run aground, we run aground, and that's all there is of it." "I sounded as far as maybe a little over a fathom," said the mate, "but the villains would let me go no nearer. I think I was in the channel, though. 'Tis more open inside as I mind me of it. There's a kind of hole there, and if we can get in over the shoals just beyond where I was, we'll be all right." "Very well, then, you take the wheel, Baldwin," said the lieutenant, "and do the best you can for us." Lieutenant Maynard stood looking out forward at the pirate vessel, which they were now steadily nearing under half sail. He could see that there were signs of bustle aboard and of men running around upon the deck. Then he walked aft and around the cabin. The sloop was some distance astern. It appeared to have run aground, and they were trying to push it off with the sweeps. The lieutenant looked down into the water over the stern, and saw that the schooner was already raising the mud in her wake. Then he went forward along the deck. His men were crouching down along by the low rail, and there was a tense quietness of expectation about them. The lieutenant looked them over as he passed them. "Johnson," he said, "do you take the lead and line and go forward and sound a bit." Then to the others, "Now, my men, the moment we run her aboard, you get aboard of her as quick as you can, do you understand? Don't wait for the sloop or think about her, but just see that the grappling irons are fast, and then get aboard. If any man offers to resist you, shoot him down. Are you ready, Mr. Kringle?" "Aye, aye, sir," said the gunner. "Very well, then. Be ready, men. We'll be aboard 'em in a minute or two." "There's less than a fathom of water here, sir," sang out Johnson from the bows. As he spoke there was a sudden soft jar and jerk, then the schooner was still. They were aground. "Push her off to the lee there. Let go your sheets," roared the boatswain from the wheel. "Push her off to the lee." He spun the wheel around as he spoke. Half a dozen men sprang up, seized the sweeps, and plunged them into the water. Others ran to help them, but the sweeps only sank into the mud without moving the schooner. The sails had fallen off, and they were flapping and thumping and clapping in the wind. Others of the crew had scrambled to their feet and ran to help those at the sweeps. The lieutenant had walked quickly aft again. They were very close now to the pirate sloop, and suddenly someone hailed him from aboard of her. When he turned, he saw that there was a man standing up on the rail of the pirate sloop, holding by the backstays. "Who are you?" he called from the distance. "And whence come you? What do you seek here? What d'ye mean, coming down on us this way?" The lieutenant heard somebody say, "That's Blackbeard hisself," and he looked with great interest at the distant figure. The pirate stood out boldly against the cloudy sky. Somebody seemed to speak to him from behind. He turned his head, and then he turned round again. "We're only peaceful merchantmen," he called out. "What authority have you got to come down upon us this way? If you'll come aboard I'll show you my papers, and that we're only peaceful merchantmen." "The villains!" said the lieutenant to the master, who stood beside him. "They're peaceful merchantmen, are they? They look like peaceful merchantmen, with 4 carronades and a long gun aboard." Then he called out across the water, "I'll come aboard with my schooner as soon as I can push her off here." "If you undertake to come aboard of me," called the pirate, "I'll shoot into you. You've got no authority to board me, and I won't have you do it. If you undertake it 'twill be at your own risk, for I'll neither ask quarter of you nor give none." "Very well," said the lieutenant. "If you choose to try that you may do so as you please, for I'm coming aboard of you as sure as heaven." "Push off the bow there," called the boatswain at the wheel. "Look alive! Why don't you push off the bow?" "She's hard aground," answered the gunner. "We can't budge her an inch." "If they was to fire into us now," said the sailing master, "they'd smash us to pieces." "They won't fire into us," said the lieutenant. "They won't dare to." He jumped down from the cabin deckhouse as he spoke, and went forward to urge the men in pushing off the boat. It was already beginning to move. At that moment the sailing master suddenly called out, "Mr. Maynard! Mr. Maynard! They're going to give us a broadside!" Almost before the words were out of his mouth, before Lieutenant Maynard could turn, there came a loud and deafening crash, and then instantly another, and a third, and almost as instantly a crackling and rending of broken wood. There were clean yellow splinters flying everywhere. A man fell violently against the lieutenant, nearly overturning him, but he caught at the stays and so saved himself. For one tense moment he stood holding his breath. Then all about him arose a sudden outcry of groans and shouts and oaths. The man who had fallen against him was lying face down upon the deck. His thighs were quivering, and a pool of blood was spreading and running out from under him. There were other men down all about the deck. Some were rising, some were trying to rise, some only moved. There was a distant sound of yelling and cheering and shouting. It was from the pirate sloop. The pirates were rushing about upon her decks. They had pulled the cannon back, and through the grunting sound of the groans about him the lieutenant could distinctly hear the thud and punch of the rammers, and he knew they were going to shoot again. The low rail offered almost no shelter against such a broadside, and there was nothing for it but to order all hands below for the time being. "Get below!" roared out the lieutenant. "All hands get below and lie snug for further orders." In obedience the men ran scrambling below into the hold, and in a little while the decks were nearly clear except for the 3 dead men and some 3 or 4 wounded. The boatswain crouching down close to the wheel and the lieutenant himself were the only others upon deck. Everywhere there were smears and sprinkles of blood. "Where's Brooks?" the lieutenant cried out. "He's hurt in the arm, sir, and he's gone below," said the boatswain. Thereupon the lieutenant himself walked over to the forecastle hatch, and, hailing the gunner, ordered him to get up another ladder, so that the men could be run up on deck if the pirates should undertake to come aboard. At that moment the boatswain at the wheel called out that the villains were going to shoot again, and the lieutenant, turning, saw the gunner aboard of the pirate sloop in the act of touching the iron to the touch-hole. He stooped down. There was another loud and deafening crash of cannon. One, two, three, four, the last two almost together, and almost instantly the boatswain called out, "'Tis the sloop, sir! Look at the sloop!" The sloop had got afloat again, and had been coming up to the aid of the schooner, when the pirates fired their second broadside now at her. When the lieutenant looked at her she was quivering with the impact of the shot, and the next moment she began falling off to the wind, and he could see the wounded men rising and falling and struggling upon her decks. At the same moment the boatswain called out that the enemy was coming aboard, and even as he spoke the pirate sloop came drifting out from the cloud of smoke that enveloped her, looming up larger and larger as she came down upon them. The lieutenant still crouched down under the rail, looking out at them. Suddenly, a little distance away, she came about, broadside on, and then drifted. She was close aboard now. Something came flying through the air, another and another. They were bottles. One of them broke with a crash upon the deck. The others rolled over to the farther rail. In each of them a quick match was smoking. Almost instantly there was a flash and a terrific report, and the air was full of the whiz and singing of broken particles of glass and iron. There was another report, and then the whole air seemed full of gunpowder smoke. "They're aboard of us!" shouted the boatswain, and even as he spoke the lieutenant roared out, "All hands to repel boarders!" A second later there came the heavy thumping bump of the vessels coming together. Lieutenant Maynard, as he called out the order, ran forward through the smoke, snatching one of his pistols out of his pocket and the cutlass out of its sheath as he did so. Behind him the men were coming, swarming up from below. There was a sudden stunning report of a pistol, and then another and another, almost together. There was a groan and the fall of a heavy body, and then a figure came jumping over the rail, with two or three more directly following. The lieutenant was in the midst of the gunpowder smoke, when suddenly Blackbeard was before him. The pirate captain had stripped himself naked to the waist. His shaggy black hair was falling over his eyes, and he looked like a demon fresh from the pit, with his frantic face. Almost with the blindness of instinct, the lieutenant thrust out his pistol, firing it as he did so. The pirate staggered back. He was down. No, he was up again. He had a pistol in each hand, but there was a stream of blood running down his naked ribs. Suddenly the mouth of a pistol was pointing straight at the lieutenant's head. He ducked instinctively, striking upward with his cutlass as he did so. There was a stunning, deafening report almost in his ear. He struck again blindly with his cutlass. He saw the flash of a sword and flung up his guard almost instinctively, meeting the crash of the descending blade. Somebody shot from behind him, and at the same moment he saw some one else strike the pirate. Blackbeard staggered again, and this time there was a great gash upon his neck. Then one of Maynard's own men tumbled headlong upon him. He fell with the man, but almost instantly he had scrambled to his feet again, and as he did so he saw that the pirate sloop had drifted a little away from them, and that their grappling irons had evidently parted. His hand was smarting as though struck with the lash of a whip. He looked around him. The pirate captain was nowhere to be seen. Yes, there he was, lying by the rail. He raised himself upon his elbow, and the lieutenant saw that he was trying to point a pistol at him, with an arm that wavered and swayed blindly, the pistol nearly falling from his fingers. Suddenly his other elbow gave way, and he fell down upon his face. He tried to raise himself. He fell down again. There was a report and a cloud of smoke, and when it cleared away, Blackbeard had staggered up again. He was a terrible figure, his head nodding down upon his breast. Somebody shot again, and then the swaying figure toppled and fell. It lay still for a moment, then rolled over, then lay still again. There was a loud splash of men jumping overboard, and then, almost instantly, the cry of "Quarter! Quarter!" The lieutenant ran to the edge of the vessel. It was as he had thought. The grappling irons of the pirate sloop had parted, and it had drifted away. The few pirates who had been left aboard of the schooner had jumped overboard and were now holding up their hands. "Quarter!" they cried. "Don't shoot! Quarter!" And the fight was over. The lieutenant looked down at his hand, and then he saw, for the first time, that there was a great cutlass gash across the back of it, and that his arm and shirt sleeve were wet with blood. He went aft, holding the wrist of his wounded hand. The boatswain was still at the wheel. "By zounds!" said the lieutenant, with a nervous, quavering laugh, "I didn't know there was such fight in the villains." His wounded and shattered sloop was again coming up toward him under sail, but the pirates had surrendered, and the fight was over. End of Jack Ballister's Fortunes, Part 2. Section 12 of Howard Pyle's Book of Pirates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barry Eads. Howard Pyle's Book of Pirates by Howard Pyle. Compiled by Merle Johnson. Blueskin, the Pirate, Part 1. Subchapter 1. Cape May and Cape Henlopen form, as it were, the upper and lower jaws of a gigantic mouth, which disgorges from its monstrous gullet the cloudy waters of the Delaware Bay into the heaving, sparkling blue-green of the Atlantic Ocean. From Cape Henlopen, as the lower jaw there juts out a long curving fang of high, smooth-rolling sand dunes, cutting sharp and clean against the still blue sky above. Silent, naked, utterly deserted excepting for the squat, white-walled lighthouse standing upon the crest of the highest hill. Within this curving, sheltering hook of sandhills lie the smooth waters of Lewes Harbor, and, set a little back from the shore, the quaint old town, with its dingy wooden houses of clapboard and shingle, looks sleepily out through the mass of the shipping lying at anchor in the harbor, to the purple, clean-cut, level thread of the ocean horizon beyond. Lewes is a queer, odd, old-fashioned little town, smelling fragrant of salt marsh and sea breeze. It is rarely visited by strangers. The people who live there are the progeny of people who have lived there for many generations, and it is the very place to nurse and preserve and care for old legends and traditions of bygone times, until they grow from bits of gossip and news into local history of considerable size. As the busier world men talk of last year's elections, here these old bits and scraps and odds and ends of history are retailed to the listener who cares to listen. Traditions of the War of 1812, when Beresford's fleet lay off the harbor threatening to bombard the town; tales of the Revolution and of Earl Howe's warships, tarrying for a while in the quiet harbor before they sailed up the river to shake old Philadelphia town with the thunders of their guns at Red Bank and Fort Mifflin. With these substantial and sober threads of real history, other and more lucid colors are interwoven into the web of local lore. Legends of the dark doings of famous pirates, of their mysteries, sinister comings and goings, of treasures buried in the sand dunes and pine barrens back of the Cape, and along the Atlantic beach to the southward. Of such is the story of Blueskin, the pirate. Subchapter 2. It was in the fall and early winter of the year 1750, and again in the summer of the year following, that the famous pirate, Blueskin, became especially identified with Lewes as a part of its traditional history. For some time, for 3 or 4 years, rumors and reports of Blueskin's doings in the West Indies and off the Carolinas had been brought in now and then by sea captains. There was no more cruel, bloody, desperate, devilish pirate than he in all those pirate-infested waters. All kinds of wild and bloody stories were current concerning him, but it never occurred to the good folk of Lewes that such stories were some time to be a part of their own history. But one day a schooner came drifting into Lewes harbor, shattered, wounded, her forecastle splintered, her foremast shot half away, and 3 great tattered holes in her mainsail. The mate with one of the crew came ashore in the boat for help and a doctor. He reported that the captain and the cook were dead, and there were 3 wounded men aboard. The story he told to the gathering crowd brought a very peculiar thrill to those who heard it. They had fallen in with Blueskin, he said, off Fenwick's Island, some 20 or 30 miles below the Capes, and the pirates had come aboard of them, but finding that the cargo of the schooner consisted only of cypress shingles and lumber, had soon quitted their prize. Perhaps Blueskin was disappointed at not finding a more valuable capture. Perhaps the spirit of deviltry was hotter in him that morning than usual. Anyhow, as the pirate craft bore away, she fired 3 broadsides at short range into the helpless coaster. The captain had been killed at the first fire, the cook had died on the way up, 3 of the crew were wounded, and the vessel was leaking fast, betwixt wind and water. Such was the mate's story. It spread like wildfire, and in half an hour all the town was in a ferment. Fenwick's Island was very near home. Blueskin might come sailing into the harbor at any minute, and then In an hour Sheriff Jones had called together most of the able-bodied men of the town. Muskets and rifles were taken down from the chimney places, and every preparation was made to defend the place against the pirates, should they come into the harbor and attempt to land. But Blueskin did not come that day, nor did he come the next or the next. But on the afternoon of the 3rd the news went suddenly flying over the town that the pirates were inside the capes. As the report spread the people came running, men, women, and children, to the green before the tavern, where a little knot of old seamen were gathered together, looking fixedly out toward the offing, talking in low voices. 2 vessels, one bark-rigged, the other and smaller a sloop, were slowly creeping up the bay, a couple of miles or so away and just inside the cape. There appeared nothing remarkable about the 2 crafts, but the little crowd that continued gathering upon the green stood looking out across the bay at them, none the less anxiously for that. They were sailing close hauled to the wind, the sloop following in the wake of her consort as the pilot fish follows in the wake of the shark. But the course they held did not lie toward the harbor, but rather bore away toward the Jersey shore, and by it began to be apparent that Blueskin did not intend visiting the town. Nevertheless, those who stood looking did not draw a free breath until, after watching the 2 pirates for more than an hour and a half, they saw them, then about 6 miles away, suddenly put about and sail with a free wind out to sea again. "The bloody villains have gone," said old Captain Wolfe, shutting his telescope with a click. But Lewes was not yet quit of Blueskin. 2 days later a half-breed from Indian River Bay came up, bringing the news that the pirates had sailed into the inlet, some 15 miles below Lewes, and had careened the bark to clean her. Perhaps Blueskin did not care to stir up the country people against him, for the half-breed reported that the pirates were doing no harm, and that what they took from the farmers of Indian River and Rehoboth they paid for with good hard money. It was while the excitement over the pirates was at its highest fever heat that Levi West came home again. Subchapter 3. Even in the middle of the last century, the grist mill, a couple of miles from Lewes, although it was at most but 50 or 60 years old, had all a look of weather-beaten age, for the cypress shingles, of which it was built, ripen in a few years of wind and weather to a silvery hoary gray, and the white powdering of flour lent it a look as though the dust of ages had settled upon it, making the shadows within dim, soft, mysterious. A dozen willow trees shaded with dappling, shivering ripples of shadow the road before the mill door, and the mill itself, and the long, narrow, shingle-built, one-storied, hip-roofed dwelling-house. At the time of the story the mill had descended in a direct line of succession to Hiram White, the grandson of old Ephraim White, who had built it, it was said, in 1701. Hiram White was only 27 years old, but he was already in local repute as a character. As a boy he was thought to be half-witted or "natural," and, as is the case with such unfortunates in small country towns where everybody knows everybody, he was made a common sport and jest for the keener, crueler wits of the neighborhood. Now that he was grown to the ripeness of manhood, he was still looked upon as being, to use a quaint expression, slack, or not "jist right." He was heavy, awkward, ungainly, and loose-jointed, and enormously, prodigiously strong. He had a lumpish, thick-featured face, with lips heavy and loosely hanging, that gave him an air of stupidity, half droll, half pathetic. His little eyes were set far apart and flat with his face. His eyebrows were nearly white, and his hair was of a sandy, colorless kind. He was singularly taciturn, lisping thickly when he did talk, and stuttering and hesitating in his speech, as though his words moved faster than his mind could follow. It was the custom for local wags to urge or badger or tempt him to talk, for the sake of the ready laugh that always followed the few thick stammering words and the stupid drooping of the jaw at the end of each short speech. Perhaps Squire Hall was the only one in Lewes Hundred who misdoubted that Hiram was half-witted. He had had dealings with him, and was wont to say that whoever bought Hiram White for a fool made a fool's bargain. Certainly, whether he had common wits or no, Hiram had managed his mill to pretty good purpose, and was fairly well off in the world as prosperity went in southern Delaware and in those days. No doubt, had it come to the pinch, he might have bought some of his tormentors out 3 times over. Hiram White had suffered quite a financial loss some 6 months before, through that very Blueskin who was now lurking in Indian River Inlet. He had entered into a venture with Joshua Shippen, a Philadelphia merchant, to the tune of £700 sterling. The money had been invested in a cargo of flour and corn meal which had shipped to Jamaica by the bark Nancy Lee. The Nancy Lee had been captured by the pirates off Currituck Sound, the crew set adrift in the longboat, and the bark herself and all her cargo burned to the water's edge. 500 of the £700 invested in the unfortunate venture was money bequeathed by Hiram's father 7 years before to Levi West. Elizur White had been twice married, the second time to the widow West. She had brought with her to her new home a good-looking, long-legged, black-eyed, black-haired ne'er-do-well of a son, a year or so younger than Hiram. He was a shrewd, quick-witted lad, idle, shiftless, wilful, ill-trained perhaps, but as bright and keen as a pin. He was the very opposite to poor, dull Hiram. Elizur White had never loved his son. He was ashamed of the poor, slack-witted oaf. Upon the other hand, he was very fond of Levi West, whom he always called "our Levi," and whom he treated in every way as though he were his own son. He tried to train the lad to work in the mill, and was patient beyond what the patience of most fathers would have been with his stepson's idleness and shiftlessness. "Never mind," he used to say. "Levi'll come all right. Levi's as bright as a button." It was one of the greatest blows of the old miller's life when Levi ran away to sea. In his last sickness the old man's mind constantly turned to his lost stepson. "Maybe he'll come back again," said he, "and if he does I want you to be good to him, Hiram. I've done my duty by you and have left you the house and mill, but I want you to promise that if Levi comes back again you'll give him a home and a shelter under this roof if he wants one." And Hiram had promised to do as his father asked. After Elizur died it was found that he had bequeathed £500 to his beloved stepson Levi West, and had left Squire Hall as trustee. Levi West had been gone nearly 9 years, and not a word had been heard from him. There could be little or no doubt that he was dead. One day Hiram came into Squire Hall's office with a letter in his hand. It was the time of the old French war, and flour and corn meal were fetching fabulous prices in the British West Indies. The letter Hiram brought with him was from a Philadelphia merchant, Josiah Shippen, with whom he had had some dealings. Mr. Shippen proposed that Hiram should join him in sending a venture of flour and corn meal to Kingston, Jamaica. Hiram had slept upon the letter overnight, and now he brought it to the old squire. Squire Hall read the letter, shaking his head the while. "Too much risk, Hiram," said he. "Mr. Shippen wouldn't have asked you to go into this venture if he could have got anybody else to do so. My advice is that you let it alone. I reckon you've come to me for advice?" Hiram shook his head. "Ye haven't? What have ye come for, then?" "£700," said Hiram. "£700," said Squire Hall. "I haven't got £700 to lend you, Hiram. 500 been left to Levi. I got 100. Raise 100 more on mortgage," said Hiram. "Tut, tut, Hiram," said Squire Hall. "That'll never do in the world. Suppose Levi West should come back again, what then? I am responsible for that money. If you wanted to borrow it now for any reasonable venture, you should have it and welcome. But for such a wildcat scheme—" "Levi never come back," said Hiram. "9 years gone. Levi's dead." "Maybe he is," said Squire Hall, "but we don't know that." "I'll give bond for security," said Hiram. Squire Hall thought for a while in silence. "Very well, Hiram," said he by and by, "if you'll do that. Your father left the money, and I don't see that it's right for me to stay his son from using it. But if it is lost, Hiram, and if Levi should come back, it will go well to ruin ye." So Hiram White invested £700 in the Jamaica venture, and every farthing of it was burned by Blueskin, off Currituck Sound. Subchapter 4. Sally Martin was said to be the prettiest girl in Lewes Hundred, and when the rumor began to leak out that Hiram White was courting her, the whole community took it as a monstrous joke. It was the common thing to greet Hiram himself with, "Hey, Hiram, how's Sally?" Hiram never made answer to such salutation, but went his way as heavily, as impassively, as dully as ever. The joke was true. Twice a week, rain or shine, Hiram White never failed to scrape his feet upon Billy Martin's doorstep. Twice a week, on Sundays and Thursdays, he never failed to make his customary seat by the kitchen fire. He rarely said anything by way of talk. He nodded to the farmer, to his wife, to Sally, and, when he chanced to be at home, to her brother, but he ventured nothing further. There he would sit from 7:30 until 9 o'clock, stolid, heavy, impassive, his dull eyes following now one of the family and now another, but always coming back again to Sally. It sometimes happened that she had other company, some of the young men of the neighborhood. The presence of such seemed to make no difference to Hiram. He bore whatever broad jokes might be cracked upon him, whatever grins, whatever giggling might follow those jokes, with the same patient impassiveness. There he would sit, silent, unresponsive. Then, at the first stroke of 9 o'clock, he would rise, shoulder his ungainly person into his overcoat, twist his head into his three-cornered hat, and with a "Good night, Sally, I be goin' now," would take his departure, shutting the door carefully to behind him. Never perhaps was there a girl in the world had such a lover and such a courtship as Sally Martin. Subchapter 5. It was one Thursday evening, in the latter part of November, about a week after Blueskin's appearance off the Capes, and while the one subject of talk was of the pirates being in Indian River Inlet. The air was still and wintry. A sudden cold snap had set in, and skins of ice had formed over puddles in the road. The smoke from the chimneys rose straight in the quiet air, and voices sounded loud, as they do in frosty weather. Hiram White sat by the dim light of a tallow dip, poring laboriously over some account books. It was not quite 7 o'clock, and he never started for Billy Martin's before that hour. As he ran his fingers slowly and hesitantly down the column of figures, he heard the kitchen door beyond open and shut, the noise of footsteps crossing the floor, and the scraping of a chair dragged forward to the hearth. Then came the sound of a basket of corn cobs being emptied on the smoldering blaze, and then the snapping and crackling of the reanimated fire. Hiram thought nothing of all this, excepting, in a dim sort of way, that it was Bob, the negro mill hand, or old black Dinah, the housekeeper, and so went on with his calculations. At last he closed the books with a snap, and, smoothing down his hair, arose, took up the candle, and passed out of the room into the kitchen beyond. A man was sitting in front of the corncob fire that flamed and blazed in the great, gaping, sooty fireplace. A rough overcoat was flung over the chair behind him, and his hands were spread out to the roaring warmth. At the sound of the lifted latch and of Hiram's entrance, he turned his head, and when Hiram saw his face, he stood suddenly still as though turned to stone. The face, marvelously altered and changed as it was the face of his stepbrother, Levi West. He was not dead. He had come home again. For a time not a sound broke the dead, unbroken silence, excepting the crackling of the blaze in the fireplace and the sharp ticking of the tall clock in the corner. The one face, dull and stolid, with the light of the candle shining upward over its lumpy features, looked fixedly, immovably, stonily at the other, sharp, shrewd, cunning, the red wavering light of the blaze shining upon the high cheekbones, cutting sharp on the nose, and twinkling in the glassy turn of the black, rat-like eyes. Then suddenly that face cracked, broadened, spread to a grin. "I've come back again, Hi," said Levi, and at the sound of the words the speechless spell was broken. Hiram answered never a word, but he walked to the fireplace, set the candle down upon the dusty mantel shelf among the boxes and bottles, and, drawing forward a chair upon the other side of the hearth, sat down. His dull little eyes never moved from his stepbrother's face. There was no curiosity in his expression, no surprise, no wonder. The heavy under lip drooped a little farther open, and there was more than usual of dull, expressionless stupidity upon the lumpish face, but that was all. As was said, the face upon which he looked was strangely, marvellously changed from what it had been when he had last seen it 9 years before, and though it was still the face of Levi West, it was a very different Levi West than the shiftless ne'er do well who had run away to sea in the Brazilian brig that long time ago. That Levi West had been a rough, careless, happy go lucky fellow, thoughtless and selfish, but with nothing essentially evil or sinister in his nature. The Levi West that now sat in the rush bottomed chair at the other side of the fireplace had that stamped upon his front that might be both evil and sinister. His swart complexion was tanned to an Indian copper. On one side of his face was a curious discoloration in the skin and a long, crooked, cruel scar that ran diagonally across the forehead and temple and cheek in a white, jagged seam. This discoloration was of a livid blue, about the tint of a tattoo mark. It made a patch the size of a man's hand, lying across the cheek and the side of the neck. Hiram could not keep his eyes from this mark and the white scar cutting across it. There was an odd sort of incongruity in Levi's dress. A pair of heavy gold earrings and a dirty red handkerchief knotted loosely around his neck beneath an open collar, displaying to its full length the lean, sinewy throat with its bony Adam's apple, gave to his costume somewhat the smack of a sailor. He wore a coat that had once been of fine plum color, now stained and faded, too small for his lean length, and furbished with tarnished lace. Dirty cambric cuffs hung at his wrists, and on his fingers were half a dozen or more rings, set with stones that shone and glistened, and twinkled in the light of the fire. The hair at either temple was twisted into a Spanish curl, plastered flat to the cheek, and a plaited queue hung halfway down his back. Hiram, speaking never a word, sat motionless, his dull little eyes traveling slowly up and down and around his stepbrother's person. Levi did not seem to notice his scrutiny, leaning forward, now with his palms spread out to the grateful warmth, now rubbing them slowly together. But at last he suddenly whirled his chair around, rasping on the floor, and faced his stepbrother. He thrust his hands into his capacious coat pocket and brought out a pipe which he proceeded to fill from a skin of tobacco. "Well, hi," said he. "D'ye see I've come back home again?" "Thought you was dead," said Hiram dully. Levi laughed. Then he drew a red-hot coal out of the fire, put it upon the bowl of the pipe, and began puffing out clouds of pungent smoke. "Nay, nay," said he, "not dead, not dead by odds. But, puff, by the eternal holy, hi, I played many a close game, puff, with old Davy Jones, for all that." Hiram's look turned inquiringly toward the jagged scar, and Levi caught the slow glance. "You're looking at this," said he, running his finger down the crooked seam. "That looks bad, but it wasn't so close as this," laying his hand for a moment upon the livid stain. "A coolie devil off Singapore gave me that cut when we fell foul of an opium junk in the China Sea 4 years ago last September. This," touching the disfiguring blue patch again, "was a closer miss, hi. A Spanish captain fired a pistol at me down off Santa Catharina. He was so nigh that the powder went under the skin, and it'll never come out again. His eyes, he had better have fired the pistol into his own head that morning. But never mind that. I reckon I'm changed, ain't I, hi?" He took his pipe out of his mouth and looked inquiringly at Hiram, who nodded. Levi laughed. "Never doubt it," said he, "but whether I'm changed or no, I'll take my affidavy that you are the same old half-witted hi that you used to be. I remember Dad used to say that you hadn't no more than enough wits to keep you out of the rain. And, talking of Dad, hi, I hearn tell he's been dead now these 9 years gone. Do ye know what I've come home for?" Hiram shook his head. "I've come for that £500 that Dad left me when he died, for I hearn tell of that, too." Hiram sat quite still for a second or two, and then he said, "I put that money out to venture and lost it all." Levi's face fell, and he took his pipe out of his mouth, regarding Hiram sharply and keenly. "What d'ye mean?" said he presently. "I thought you was dead, and I put £700 into Nancy Lee, and Blueskin burned her off Currituck." "Burned her off Currituck!" repeated Levi. Then suddenly a light seemed to break upon his comprehension. "Burned by Blueskin," he repeated, and thereupon flung himself back in his chair and burst into a short, boisterous fit of laughter. "Well, by the holy eternal, Hi, if that isn't a piece of your tarnal luck! Burned by Blueskin, was it?" He paused for a moment, as though turning it over in his mind. Then he laughed again. "All the same," said he presently, "d'ye see, I can't suffer for Blueskin's doings. The money was willed to me, fair and true, and you have got to pay it, Hiram White, burn or sink, Blueskin or no Blueskin." Again he puffed for a moment or two in reflective silence. "All the same, Hi," said he, once more resuming the thread of talk, "I don't reckon to be too hard on you. You be only half witted, anyway, and I shan't be too hard on you. I give you a month to raise that money, and while you're doing it I'll just hang around here. I've been in trouble, Hi, d'ye see. I'm under a cloud, and so I want to keep here, as quiet as may be. I'll tell ye how it came about. I had a set to with a land pirate in Philadelphia, and somebody got hurt. That's the reason I'm here now, and don't you say anything about it, do you understand?" Hiram opened his lips as though it was his intent to answer, then seemed to think better of it, and contented himself by nodding his head. That Thursday night was the first for a 6 month that Hiram White did not scrape his feet clean at Billy Martin's doorstep. End of Section 12. Section 13 of Howard Pyle's Book of Pirates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barry Eads. Howard Pyle's Book of Pirates by Howard Pyle. Compiled by Merle Johnson. Blueskin the Pirate, Part 2. Subchapter 6. Within a week Levi West had pretty well established himself among his old friends and acquaintances, though upon a different footing from that of 9 years before, for this was a very different Levi from that other. Nevertheless, he was none the less popular in the bar room of the tavern and at the country store, where he was always the center of a group of loungers. His 9 years seemed to have been crowded full of the wildest of wild adventures and happenings, as well by land as by sea, and, given an appreciative audience, he would reel off his yarns by the hour, in a reckless, devil-may-care fashion that set agape even old sea dogs who had sailed the Western Ocean since boyhood. Then he seemed always to have plenty of money, and he loved to spend it at the tavern tap-room, with a lavishness that was at once the wonder and admiration of gossips. At that time, as was said, Blueskin was the one engrossing topic of talk, and it added not a little to Levi's prestige when it was found that he had actually often seen that bloody devilish pirate with his own eyes. A great, heavy, burly fellow, Levi said he was, with a beard as black as a hat, a devil with his sword and pistol afloat, but not so black as he was painted when ashore. He told of many adventures in which Blueskin figured and was then always listened to with more than usual gaping interest. As for Blueskin, the quiet way in which the pirates conducted themselves at Indian River almost made the loose folk forget what he could do when the occasion called. They almost ceased to remember that poor shattered schooner that had crawled with its ghastly dead and groaning wounded into the harbor a couple of weeks since. But if for a while they forgot who or what Blueskin was, it was not for long. One day a bark from Bristol, bound for Cuba and laden with a valuable cargo of cloth stuffs and silks, put into Lewes Harbor to take in water. The captain himself came ashore and was at the tavern for 2 or 3 hours. It happened that Levi was there and that the talk was of Blueskin. The English captain, a grizzled old sea dog, listened to Levi's yarns with not a little contempt. He had, he said, sailed in the China Sea and the Indian Ocean too long to be afraid of any hog-eating Yankee pirate such as this Blueskin. A junk full of coolies armed with stinkpots was something to speak of, but who ever heard of the likes of Blueskin falling afoul of anything more than a Spanish canoe or a Yankee coaster? Levi grinned. "All the same, my hearty," said he, "if I was you I'd give Blueskin a wide berth. I hear that he's cleaned the vessel that was careened a while ago, and maybe he'll give you a little trouble if you come too nigh him." To this the Englishman only answered that Blueskin might be blank, and that the next afternoon, wind and weather permitting, he intended to heave anchor and run out to sea. Levi laughed again. "I wish I might be here to see what'll happen," said he, "but I'm going up the river to night to see a gal, and maybe won't be back again for 3 or 4 days." The next afternoon the English bark set sail as the captain promised, and that night Lewes town was awake until almost morning, gazing at a broad red glare that lighted up the sky away toward the southeast. 2 days afterward a negro oysterman came up from Indian River with news that the pirates were lying off the inlet, bringing ashore bales of goods from their larger vessel and piling the same upon the beach under tarpaulins. He said that it was known down at Indian River that Blueskin had fallen afoul of an English bark, had burned her, and had murdered the captain and all but 3 of the crew, who had joined with the pirates. The excitement over this terrible happening had only begun to subside when another occurred to cap it. One afternoon a ship's boat, in which were 5 men and 2 women, came rowing into Lewes harbor. It was the long boat of the Charleston packet, bound for New York, and was commanded by the first mate. The packet had been attacked and captured by the pirates about 10 leagues south by east of Cape Henlopen. The pirates had come aboard of them at night, and no resistance had been offered. Perhaps it was this circumstance that saved the lives of all, for no murder or violence had been done. Nevertheless, officers, passengers, and crew had been stripped of everything of value and set adrift in the boats, and the ship herself had been burned. The longboat had become separated from the others during the night, and had sighted Henlopen a little after sunrise. It might be here said that Squire Hall made out a report of these 2 occurrences and sent it up to Philadelphia by the mate of the packet. But for some reason it was nearly 4 weeks before a sloop of war was sent around from New York. In the meanwhile the pirates had disposed of the booty stored under the tarpaulins on the beach at Indian River Inlet, shipping some of it away in 2 small sloops and sending the rest by wagons somewhere up the country. Subchapter 7. Levi had told the English captain that he was going up country to visit one of his lady friends. He was gone nearly 2 weeks. Then once more he appeared as suddenly, as unexpectedly, as he had done when he first returned to Lewes. Hiram was sitting at supper when the door opened and Levi walked in, hanging up his hat behind the door as unconcernedly as though he had only been gone an hour. He was in an ugly, lowering humor, and sat himself down at the table without uttering a word, resting his chin upon his clenched fist and glowering fixedly at the corn cake while Dinah fetched him a plate and knife and fork. His coming seemed to have taken away all of Hiram's appetite. He pushed away his plate and sat staring at his stepbrother, who presently fell to at the bacon and eggs like a famished wolf. Not a word was said until Levi had ended his meal and filled his pipe. "Look'ee, Hiram," said he, as he stooped over the fire and raked out a hot coal. "Look'ee, Hiram, I've been to Philadelphia, d'ye see, a settlin' up that trouble I told you about when I first came home. D'ye understand? D'ye remember? D'ye get it through your skull?" He looked around over his shoulder, waiting as though for an answer, but getting none, he continued: "I expect 2 gentlemen here from Philadelphia to night. They're friends of mine, and are coming to talk over the business, and ye needn't stay at home, Hi. You can go out somewhere, d'ye understand?" And then he added with a grin, "Ye can go see Sally." Hiram pushed back his chair and arose. He leaned with his back against the side of the fireplace. "I'll stay at home," said he presently. "But I don't want you to stay at home, Hi," said Levi. "We'll have to talk business, and I want you to go." "I'll stay at home," said Hiram again. Levi's brow grew as black as thunder. He ground his teeth together, and for a moment or 2 it seemed as though an explosion was coming. But he swallowed his passion with a gulp. "You're a pig-headed, half-witted fool," said he. Hiram never so much as moved his eyes. "As for you," said Levi, whirling round upon Dinah, who was clearing the table, and glowering balefully upon the old negress, "you put them things down and git out of here. Don't you come nigh this kitchen again till I tell ye to. If I catch you pryin' around may I be blank, eyes and liver, if I don't cut your heart out." In about half an hour Levi's friends came. The first a little, thin, wizened man with a very foreign look. He was dressed in a rusty black suit and wore gray yarn stockings and shoes with brass buckles. The other was also plainly a foreigner. He was dressed in sailor fashion, with petticoat breeches of duck, a heavy pea jacket, and thick boots reaching to the knees. He wore a red sash tied around his waist, and once, as he pushed back his coat, Hiram saw the glitter of a pistol butt. He was a powerful, thick-set man, low-browed and bull-necked, his cheek and chin and throat closely covered with a stubble of blue-black beard. He wore a red kerchief tied around his head, and over it a cocked hat, edged with tarnished gilt braid. Levi himself opened the door to them. He exchanged a few words outside with his visitors, in a foreign language of which Hiram understood nothing. Neither of the two strangers spoke a word to Hiram. The little man shot him a sharp look out of the corners of his eyes, and the burly ruffian scowled blackly at him, but beyond that neither vouchsafed him any regard. Levi drew to the shutters, shut the bolt in the outer door, and tilted a chair against the latch of the one that led from the kitchen into the adjoining room. Then the three worthies seated themselves at the table which Dinah had half cleared of the supper china, and were presently deeply engrossed over a packet of papers which the big burly man had brought with him in the pocket of his pea jacket. The confabulation was conducted throughout in the same foreign language which Levi had used when first speaking to them, a language quite unintelligible to Hiram's ears. Now and then the murmur of talk would rise loud and harsh over some disputed point, now and then it would sink away to whispers. Twice the tall clock in the corner whirred and sharply struck the hour, but throughout the whole long consultation Hiram stood silent, motionless as a stock, his eyes fixed almost unwinkingly upon the three heads grouped close together around the dim, flickering light of the candle and the papers scattered upon the table. Suddenly the talk came to an end, the three heads separated, and the three chairs were pushed back, grating harshly. Levi rose, went to the closet, and brought thence a bottle of Hiram's apple brandy, as coolly as though it belonged to himself. He set 3 tumblers and a crock of water upon the table, and each helped himself liberally. As the two visitors departed down the road, Levi stood for a while at the open door, looking after the dusky figures until they were swallowed in the darkness. Then he turned, came in, shut the door, shuddered, took a final dose of the apple brandy, and went to bed, without, since his first suppressed explosion, having said a single word to Hiram. Hiram, left alone, stood for a while, silent, motionless as ever. Then he looked slowly about him, gave a shake of the shoulders as though to arouse himself, and taking the candle, left the room, shutting the door noiselessly behind him. Subchapter 8. This time of Levi West's unwelcome visitation was indeed a time of bitter trouble and tribulation to poor Hiram White. Money was of very different value in those days than it is now, and £500 was in its way a good round lump. In Sussex County it was almost a fortune. It was a desperate struggle for Hiram to raise the amount of his father's bequest to his stepbrother. Squire Hall, as may have been gathered, had a very warm and friendly feeling for Hiram, believing in him when all others disbelieved. Nevertheless, in the matter of money, the old man was as hard and as cold as adamant. He would, he said, do all he could to help Hiram, but that £500 must and should be raised. Hiram must release his security bond. He would loan him, he said, £300, taking a mortgage upon the mill. He would have lent him £400, but that there was already a first mortgage of £100 upon it, and he would not dare to put more than £300 more on top of that. Hiram had a considerable quantity of wheat, which he had bought upon speculation, and which was then lying idle in a Philadelphia storehouse. This he had sold at public sale and at a very great sacrifice. He realized barely £100 upon it. The financial horizon looked very black to him. Nevertheless, Levi's £500 was raised and paid into Squire Hall's hands, and Squire Hall released Hiram's bond. The business was finally closed on one cold gray afternoon in the early part of December. As Hiram tore his bond across and then tore it across again and again, Squire Hall pushed back the papers upon his desk and cocked his feet upon its slanting top. "Hiram," said he abruptly, "Hiram, do you know that Levi West is forever hanging around Billy Martin's house, after that pretty daughter of his?" So long a space of silence followed the speech that the Squire began to think that Hiram might not have heard him. But Hiram had heard. "No," said he, "I didn't know it." "Well, he is," said Squire Hall. "It's the talk of the whole neighborhood. The talk's pretty bad, too. Do ye know that they say that she was away from home 3 days last week, nobody knew where? The fellows turned her head with his sailor's yarns and his traveller's lies." Hiram said not a word, but he sat looking at the other in stolid silence. "That stepbrother of yours," continued the old Squire presently, "is a rascal. He is a rascal, Hiram, and I misdoubt he's something worse. I hear he's been seen in some queer places and with queer company of late." He stopped again, and still Hiram said nothing. "And lookee, Hiram," the old man resumed, suddenly, "I do hear that you be courting the girl, too. Is that so?" "Yes," said Hiram, "I'm courting her, too." "Tut, tut," said the Squire. "That's a pity, Hiram. I'm afraid your cakes are dough." After he had left the Squire's office, Hiram stood for a while in the street, bareheaded, his hat in his hand, staring unwinkingly down at the ground at his feet, with stupidly drooling lips and lackluster eyes. Presently he raised his hand and began slowly smoothing down the sandy shock of hair upon his forehead. At last he aroused himself with a shake, looked dully up and down the street, and then, putting on his hat, turned and walked slowly and heavily away. The early dusk of the cloudy winter evening was settling fast, for the sky was leaden and threatening. At the outskirts of the town Hiram stopped again and again stood for a while in brooding thought. Then finally he turned slowly, not the way that led homeward, but taking the road that led between the bare and withered fields and crooked fences toward Billy Martin's. It would be hard to say just what it was that led Hiram to seek Billy Martin's house at that time of day, whether it was fate or ill fortune. He could not have chosen a more opportune time to confirm his own undoing. What he saw was the very worst that his heart feared. Along the road, at a little distance from the house, was a mock orange hedge, now bare, naked, leafless. As Hiram drew near he heard footsteps approaching and low voices. He drew back into the fence corner, and there stood, half sheltered by the stark network of twigs. Two figures passed slowly along the gray of the roadway in the gloaming. One was his stepbrother, the other was Sally Martin. Levi's arm was around her. He was whispering into her ear, and her head rested upon his shoulder. Hiram stood as still, as breathless, as cold as ice. They stopped upon the side of the road just beyond where he stood. Hiram's eyes never left them. There for some time they talked together in low voices, their words now and then reaching the ears of that silent, breathless listener. Suddenly there came the clattering of an opening door, and then Betty Martin's voice broke the silence, harshly, shrilly. "Sal! Sal! Sally Martin! You, Sally Martin! Come in yer! Where be ye?" The girl flung her arms around Levi's neck, and their lips met in one quick kiss. The next moment she was gone, flying swiftly, silently, down the road past where Hiram stood, stooping as she ran. Levi stood looking after her until she was gone, then he turned and walked away whistling. His whistling died shrilly into silence in the wintry distance, and then at last Hiram came stumbling out from the hedge. His face had never looked before as it looked then. Subchapter 9. Hiram was standing in front of the fire with his hands clasped behind his back. He had not touched the supper on the table. Levi was eating with an appetite. Suddenly he looked over his plate at his stepbrother. "How about that £500, Hiram?" said he. "I gave ye a month to raise it, and the month ain't quite up yet, but I'm going to leave this here place day after to morrow, by next day at the furtest, and I want the money that's mine. I paid it to Squire Hall to day, and he has it for ye," said Hiram dully. Levi laid down his knife and fork with a clatter. "Squire Hall!" said he. "What's Squire Hall got to do with it? Squire Hall didn't have the use of that money. It was you had it, and you have got to pay it back to me, and if you don't do it, by gee, I'll have the law on you, sure as you're born." "Squire Hall's trustee. I ain't your trustee," said Hiram in the same dull voice. "I don't know nothing about trustees," said Levi, "or anything about lawyer business either. What I want to know is, are you going to pay me my money or no?" "No," said Hiram, "I ain't. Squire Hall'll pay ye. You go to him." Levi West's face grew purple red. He pushed back, his chair grating harshly. "You bloody land pirate," he said, grinding his teeth together. "I see through your tricks. You're up to cheating me out of my money. You know very well that Squire Hall is down on me, hard and bitter, writin' his blank reports to Philadelphia, and doing all he can to stir up everybody agin me and to bring the Blue Jackets down on me. I see through your tricks as clear as glass, but ye shan't trick me. I'll have my money if there's law in the land, ye bloody, unnatural thief ye, who'd go agin your dead father's will." Then, if the roof had fallen in upon him, Levi West could not have been more amazed. Hiram suddenly strode forward, and leaning half across the table with his fists clenched, fairly glared into Levi's eyes. His face, dull, stupid, wooden, was now fairly convulsed with passion. The great veins stood out upon his temples like knotted whipcords, and when he spoke his voice was more a breathless snarl than the voice of a Christian man. "Ye'll have the law, will ye?" said he. "Ye'll have the law, will ye? You're afeard to go to law, Levi West. You try the law, and see how ye like it. Who're ye to call me thief, ye bloody murderin' villain ye? You're the thief, Levi West. You come here and stole my daddy from me, ye did. You make me ruin myself to pay oughter to been mine. Then ye steal the gal I was courtin' to boot." He stopped, and his lips writhed for words to say. "I know ye," said he, grinding his teeth. "I know ye, and only for what my daddy made me promise I'd a had you up to the magistrates before this." Then, pointing with quivering finger, "There's the door. You see it. Go out that there door and don't never come into it again. If ye do, or if ye ever come where I can lay eyes upon ye again, by the holy holy I'll hale ye up to the squire's office and tell all I know and all I've seen. Oh, I'll give ye your belly full of law if ye want the law. Get out of the house, I say." As Hiram spoke, Levi seemed to shrink together. His face changed from its copper color to a dull, waxy yellow. When the other ended, he answered never a word, but he pushed back his chair, rose, put on his hat, and, with a furtive, sidelong look, left the house, without stopping to finish the supper which he had begun. He never entered Hiram White's door again. Subchapter 10. Hiram had driven out the evil spirit from his home, but the mischief that it had brewed was done and could not be undone. The next day it was known that Sally Martin had run away from home, and that she had run away with Levi West. Old Billy Martin had been in town in the morning with his rifle, hunting for Levi, and threatening if he caught him to have his life for leading his daughter astray. And as the evil spirit had left Hiram's house, so had another and a greater evil spirit quitted its harborage. It was heard from Indian River in a few days more that Blueskin had quitted the inlet and had sailed away to the southeast, and it was reported, by those who seemed to know, that he had finally quitted those parts. It was well for himself that Blueskin left when he did, for not 3 days after he sailed away the Scorpion sloop of war dropped anchor in Lewes Harbor. The New York agent of the unfortunate packet and a government commissioner had also come aboard the Scorpion. Without loss of time the officer in command instituted a keen and searching examination that brought to light some singularly curious facts. It was found that a very friendly understanding must have existed for some time between the pirates and the people of Indian River, for in the houses throughout that section many things, some of considerable value, that had been taken by the pirates from the packet were discovered and seized by the commissioner. Valuables of a suspicious nature that had found way even into the houses of Lewes itself. The whole neighborhood seemed to have become more or less tainted by the presence of the pirates. Even poor Hiram White did not escape the suspicions of having had dealings with them. Of course, the examiners were not slow in discovering that Levi West had been deeply concerned with Blueskin's doings. Old Dinah and Black Bob were examined, and not only did the story of Levi's 2 visitors come to light, but also the fact that Hiram was present and with them while they were in the house disposing of the captured goods to their agent. Of all that he had endured, nothing seemed to cut poor Hiram so deeply and keenly as these unjust suspicions. They seemed to bring the last bitter pang, hardest of all to bear. Levi had taken from him his father's love. He had driven him, if not to ruin, at least perilously close to it. He had run away with the girl he loved, and now, through him, even Hiram's good name was gone. Neither did the suspicions against him remain passive. They became active. Goldsmith's bills, to the amount of several £1,000s, had been taken in the packet, and Hiram was examined with an almost inquisitorial closeness and strictness as to whether he had or had not knowledge of their whereabouts. Under his accumulated misfortunes he grew not only more dull, more taciturn than ever, but gloomy, moody, brooding as well. For hours he would sit staring straight before him into the fire, without moving so much as a hair. One night, it was a bitterly cold night in February, with 3 inches of dry and gritty snow upon the ground, when Hiram sat thus brooding, there came of a sudden a soft tap upon the door. Low and hesitating as it was, Hiram started violently at the sound. He sat for a while, looking from right to left. Then suddenly pushing back his chair, he arose, strode to the door, and flung it wide open. It was Sally Martin. Hiram stood for a while staring blankly at her. It was she who first spoke. "Won't you let me come in, Hi?" said she. "I'm nigh starved with the cold, and I'm fit to die. I'm so hungry. For God's sake, let me come in." "Yes," said Hiram, "I'll let you come in. But why don't you go home?" The poor girl was shivering and chattering with the cold. Now she began crying, wiping her eyes with the corner of a blanket in which her head and shoulders were wrapped. "I have been home, Hiram," she said, "but Dad, he shut the door in my face. He cursed me just awful, Hi. I wish I was dead." "You better come in," said Hiram. "It's no good standing out there in the cold." He stood aside, and the girl entered, swiftly, gratefully. At Hiram's bidding, Black Dinah presently set some food before Sally, and she fell to eating ravenously, almost ferociously. Meantime, while she ate, Hiram stood with his back to the fire, looking at her face, that face once so round and rosy, now thin, pinched, haggard. "Are you sick, Sally?" said he presently. "No," said she, "but I've had pretty hard times since I left home, Hi." The tears sprang to her eyes at the recollection of her troubles, but she only wiped them hastily away with the back of her hand, without stopping in her eating. A long pause of dead silence followed. Dinah sat crouched together on a cricket on the other side of the hearth, listening with interest. Hiram did not seem to see her. "Did you go off with Levi?" said he at last, speaking abruptly. The girl looked up furtively under her brows. "You needn't be afeared to tell," he added. "Yes," said she at last, "I did go off with him, Hi." "Where have you been?" At the question she suddenly laid down her knife and fork. "Don't you ask me that, Hi," she said agitatedly. "I can't tell you that. You don't know Levi, Hiram. I daren't tell you anything he don't want me to. If I told you where I been he'd hunt me out, no matter where I was, and kill me. If you only knew what I know about him, Hiram, you wouldn't ask anything about him." Hiram stood looking brutally at her for a long time. Then at last he spoke again. "I thought a sight of you once, Sally," said he. Sally did not answer immediately, but after a while she suddenly looked up. "Hiram," said she, "if I tell ye something, will you promise on your oath not to breathe a word to any living soul?" Hiram nodded. "Then I'll tell you, but if Levi finds I've told you, he'll murder me as sure as you're standing there. Come nigher, I've got to whisper it." He leaned forward close to her where she sat. She looked swiftly from right to left, then raising her lips she breathed into his ear. "I'm an honest woman, Hi. I was married to Levi West before I run away." End of Section 13. Section 14 of Howard Pyle's Book of Pirates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barry Eads. Howard Pyle's Book of Pirates by Howard Pyle. Compiled by Merle Johnson. Blueskin the Pirate, Part 3. Subchapter 11. The winter had passed, spring had passed, and summer had come. Whatever Hiram had felt, he had made no sign of suffering. Nevertheless, his lumpy face had begun to look flabby, his cheeks hollow, and his loose jointed body shrunk more awkwardly together into its clothes. He was often awake at night, sometimes walking up and down his room until far into the small hours. It was through such a wakeful spell as this that he entered into the greatest, the most terrible, happening of his life. It was a sulphurously hot night in July. The air was like the breath of a furnace, and it was a hard matter to sleep with even the easiest mind and under the most favorable circumstances. The full moon shone in through the open window, laying a white square of light upon the floor, and Hiram, as he paced up and down, walked directly through it, his gaunt figure starting out at every turn into sudden brightness as he entered the straight line of misty light. The clock in the kitchen whirred and rang out the hour of 12, and Hiram stopped in his walk to count the strokes. The last vibration died away into silence, and still he stood motionless, now listening with a new and sudden intentness, for, even as the clock rang the last stroke, he heard soft, heavy footsteps moving slowly and cautiously along the pathway before the house and directly below the open window. A few seconds more, and he heard the creaking of rusty hinges. The mysterious visitor had entered the mill. Hiram crept softly to the window and looked out. The moon shone full on the dusty, shingled face of the old mill, not 30 steps away, and he saw that the door was standing wide open. A second or two of stillness followed, and then, as he stood looking intently, he saw the figure of a man suddenly appear, sharp and vivid, from the gaping blackness of the open doorway. Hiram could see his face as clear as day. It was Levi West, and he carried an empty meal bag over his arm. Levi West stood looking from right to left for a second or two, and then he took off his hat and wiped his brow with the back of his hand. Then he softly closed the door behind him and left the mill as he had come, and with the same cautious step. Hiram looked down upon him as he passed close to the house and almost directly beneath. He could have touched him with his hand. 50 or 60 yards from the house Levi stopped, and a second figure arose from the black shadow in the angle of the worm fence and joined him. They stood for a while talking together, Levi pointing now and then toward the mill. Then the two turned, and climbing over the fence, cut across an open field and through the tall, shaggy grass toward the southeast. Hiram straightened himself and drew a deep breath, and the moon, shining full upon his face, showed it twisted, convulsed, as it had been when he had fronted his stepbrother 7 months before in the kitchen. Great beads of sweat stood on his brow, and he wiped them away with his sleeve. Then, coatless, hatless as he was, he swung himself out of the window, dropped upon the grass, and without an instant of hesitation strode off down the road in the direction that Levi West had taken. As he climbed the fence where the two men had climbed it, he could see them in the pallid light, far away across the level, scrubby meadowland, walking toward a narrow strip of pine woods. A little later they entered the sharp-cut shadows beneath the trees and were swallowed in the darkness. With fixed eyes and close-shut lips, as doggedly, as inexorably as though he were a Nemesis hunting his enemy down, Hiram followed their footsteps across the stretch of moonlit open. Then, by and by, he also was in the shadow of the pines. Here not a sound broke the midnight hush. His feet made no noise upon the resinous softness of the ground below. In that dead, pulseless silence he could distinctly hear the distant voices of Levi and his companion, sounding loud and resonant in the hollow of the woods. Beyond the woods was a cornfield, and presently he heard the rattling of the harsh leaves as the two plunged into the tasseled jungle. Here, as in the woods, he followed them, step by step, guided by the noise of their progress through the canes. Beyond the cornfield ran a road that, skirting to the south of Lewes, led across a wooden bridge to the wide salt marshes that stretched between the town and the distant sandhills. Coming out upon this road, Hiram found that he had gained upon those he followed, and that they now were not 50 paces away, and he could see that Levi's companion carried over his shoulder what looked like a bundle of tools. He waited for a little while to let them gain their distance, and for the second time wiped his forehead with his shirt sleeve. Then, without ever once letting his eyes leave them, he climbed the fence to the roadway. For a couple of miles or more he followed the two along the white level highway, past silent, sleeping houses, past barns, sheds, and haystacks looming big in the moonlight, past fields and woods and clearings, past the dark and silent skirts of the town, and so at last out upon the wide misty salt marshes, which seemed to stretch away interminably through the pallid light, yet were bounded in the far distance by the long white line of sand hills. Across the level salt marshes he followed them, through the rank sedge and past the glossy pools in which his own inverted image stalked beneath as he stalked above. On and on, until at last they had reached a belt of scrub pines, gnarled and gray, that fringed the foot of the white sand hills. Here Hiram kept within the black network of shadow. The two whom he followed walked more in the open, with their shadows, as black as ink, walking along in the sand beside them, and now, in the dead, breathless stillness might be heard, chill and heavy, the distant thumping, pounding roar of the Atlantic surf, beating on the beach at the other side of the sand hills, half a mile away. At last the two rounded the southern end of the white bluff, and when Hiram, following, rounded it also, they were no longer to be seen. Before him the sand hill rose, smooth and steep, cutting in a sharp ridge against the sky. Up this steep hill trailed the footsteps of those he followed, disappearing over the crest. Beyond the ridge lay a round, bowl-like hollow, perhaps 50 feet across and 18 or 20 feet deep, scooped out by the eddying of the winds into an almost perfect circle. Hiram, slowly, cautiously, stealthily, followed their trailing line of footmarks, mounted to the top of the hillock and peered down into the bowl beneath. The two men were sitting upon the sand, not far from the tall, skeleton-like shaft of a dead pine tree that rose, stark and gray, from the sand in which it may once have been buried centuries ago. Subchapter 12. Levi had taken off his coat and waistcoat and was fanning himself with his hat. He was sitting upon the bag he had brought from the mill and which he had spread out upon the sand. His companion sat facing him. The moon shone full upon him, and Hiram knew him instantly. He was the same burly, forley-looking ruffian who had come with the little man to the mill that night to see Levi. He also had his hat off and was wiping his forehead and face with a red handkerchief. Beside him lay the bundle of tools he had brought, a couple of shovels, a piece of rope, and a long, sharp iron rod. The two men were talking together, but Hiram could not understand what they said, for they spoke in the same foreign language that they had before used. But he could see his stepbrother point with his finger, now to the dead tree, and now to the steep, white face of the opposite side of the bowl-like hollow. At last, having apparently rested themselves, the conference, if conference it was, came to an end, and Levi led the way, the other following, to the dead pine tree. Here he stopped and began searching, as though for some mark. Then, having found that which he looked for, he drew a tape line and a large brass pocket compass from his pocket. He gave one end of the tape line to his companion, holding the other with his thumb pressed upon a particular part of the tree. Taking his bearings by the compass, he gave now and then some orders to the other, who moved a little to the left or the right as he bade. At last he gave a word of command, and thereupon his companion drew a wooden peg from his pocket and thrust it into the sand. From this peg as a base they again measured, taking bearings by the compass, and again drove a peg. For a third time they repeated their measurements, and then, at last, seemed to have reached the point which they aimed for. Here Levi marked a cross with his heel upon the sand. His companion brought him the pointed rod which lay beside the shovels, and then stood watching as Levi thrust it deep into the sand, again and again, as though sounding for some object below. It was some while before he found that for which he was seeking, but at last the rod struck with a jar upon some hard object below. After making sure of success by one or two additional taps with the rod, Levi left it remaining where it stood, brushing the sand from his hands. "Now fetch the shovels, Pedro," said he, speaking for the first time in English. The two men were busy for a long while, shoveling away the sand. The object for which they were seeking lay buried some 6 feet deep, and the work was heavy and laborious, the shifting sand sliding back again and again into the hole. But at last the blade of one of the shovels struck upon some hard substance, and Levi stooped and brushed away the sand with the palm of his hand. Levi's companion climbed out of the hole which they had dug, and tossed the rope which he had brought with the shovels down to the other. Levi made it fast to some object below, and then himself mounted to the level of the sand above. Pulling together, the two drew up from the hole a heavy iron-bound box, nearly 3 feet long and a foot wide and deep. Levi's companion stooped and began untying the rope which had been lashed to a ring in the lid. What happened next happened suddenly, swiftly, terribly. Levi drew back a single step and shot one quick, keen look to right and to left. He passed his hand rapidly behind his back, and the next moment Hiram saw the moonlight gleam upon the long, sharp, keen blade of a knife. Levi raised his arm. Then, just as the other arose from bending over the chest, he struck, and struck again, 2 swift, powerful blows. Hiram saw the blade dive, clean and sharp, into the back, and heard the hilt strike with a dull thud against the ribs. Once, twice. The burly, black-bearded wretch gave a shrill, terrible cry and fell staggering back. Then, in an instant, with another cry, he was up and clutched Levi with a clutch of despair by the throat and by the arm. Then followed a struggle, short, terrible, silent. Not a sound was heard but the deep panting breath and the scuffling of feet in the sand, upon which there now poured and dabbled a dark purple stream. But it was a one-sided struggle and lasted only for a second or two. Levi wrenched his arm loose from the wounded man's grasp, tearing his shirt sleeve from the wrist to the shoulder as he did so. Again and again the cruel knife was lifted, and again it fell, now no longer bright but stained with red. Then suddenly all was over. Levi's companion dropped to the sand without a sound, like a bundle of rags. For a moment he lay limp and inert. Then one shuddering spasm passed over him, and he lay silent and still, with his face half buried in the sand. Levi, with the knife still gripped tight in his hand, stood leaning over his victim, looking down upon his body. His shirt and hand, and even his naked arm, were stained and blotched with blood. The moon lit up his face, and it was the face of a devil from hell. At last he gave himself a shake, stooped and wiped his knife and hand and arm upon the loose petticoat breeches of the dead man. He thrust his knife back into its sheath, drew a key from his pocket, and unlocked the chest. In the moonlight Hiram could see that it was filled mostly with paper and leather bags, full, apparently, of money. All through this awful struggle and its awful ending, Hiram lay, dumb and motionless, upon the crest of the sandhill, looking with a horrid fascination upon the death struggle in the pit below. Now Hiram arose. The sand slid whispering down from the crest as he did so, but Levi was too intent in turning over the contents of the chest to notice the slight sound. Hiram's face was ghastly pale and drawn. For one moment he opened his lips as though to speak, but no word came. So, white, silent, he stood for a few seconds, rather like a statue than a living man. Then suddenly his eyes fell upon the bag, which Levi had brought with him, no doubt, to carry back the treasure for which he and his companion were in search, and which still lay spread out on the sand where it had been flung. Then, as though a thought had suddenly flashed upon him, his whole expression changed. His lips closed tightly together as though fearing an involuntary sound might escape, and the haggard look dissolved from his face. Cautiously, slowly, he stepped over the edge of the sandhill and down the slanting face. His coming was as silent as death, for his feet made no noise as he sank ankle deep in the yielding surface. So, stealthily, step by step, he descended, reached the bag, lifted it silently. Levi, still bending over the chest and searching through the papers within, was not 4 feet away. Hiram raised the bag in his hands. He must have made some slight rustle as he did so, for suddenly Levi half turned his head. But he was one instant too late. In a flash the bag was over his head, shoulders, arms, body. Then came another struggle, as fierce, as silent, as desperate as that other, and as short. Wiry, tough, and strong as he was, with a lean, sinewy, nervous vigor, fighting desperately for his life as he was, Levi had no chance against the ponderous strength of his stepbrother. In any case, the struggle could not have lasted long. As it was, Levi stumbled backward over the body of his dead mate and fell, with Hiram upon him. Maybe he was stunned by the fall, maybe he felt the hopelessness of resistance, for he lay quite still while Hiram, kneeling upon him, drew the rope from the ring of the chest, and without uttering a word, bound it tightly around both the bag and the captive within. knotting it again and again and drawing it tight. Only once was a word spoken. "If you'll lemme go," said a muffled voice from the bag, "I'll give you £5,000. It's in that there box." Hiram answered never a word, but continued knotting the rope and drawing it tight. Subchapter 13. The Scorpion sloop of war lay in Lewes harbor all that winter and spring, probably upon the slim chance of a return of the pirates. It was about 8 o'clock in the morning, and Lieutenant Maynard was sitting in Squire Hall's office, fanning himself with his hat, and talking in a desultory fashion. Suddenly the dim and distant noise of a great crowd was heard from without, coming nearer and nearer. The squire and his visitor hurried to the door. The crowd was coming down the street shouting, jostling, struggling, some on the footway, some in the roadway. Heads were at the doors and windows looking down upon them. Nearer they came and nearer. Then at last they could see that the press surrounded and accompanied one man. It was Hiram White, hatless, coatless, the sweat running down his face in streams, but stolid and silent as ever. Over his shoulder he carried a bag, tied round and round with a rope. It was not until the crowd and the man it surrounded had come quite near that the squire and the lieutenant saw that a pair of legs in gray yarn stockings hung from the bag. It was a man he was carrying. Hiram had lugged his burden 5 miles that morning without help and with scarcely a rest on the way. He came directly toward the squire's office and, still surrounded and hustled by the crowd, up the steep steps to the office within. He flung his burden heavily upon the floor without a word and wiped his streaming forehead. The squire stood with his knuckles on his desk, staring first at Hiram and then at the strange burden he had brought. A sudden hush fell upon all, though the voices of those without sounded as loud and turbulent as ever. "What is it, Hiram?" said Squire Hall at last. Then for the first time Hiram spoke, panting thickly. "It's a bloody murderer," said he, pointing a quivering finger at the motionless figure. "Here, some of you!" called out the squire. "Come, untie this man. Who is he?" A dozen willing fingers quickly unknotted the rope and the bag was slipped from the head and body. Hair and face and eyebrows and clothes were powdered with meal, but, in spite of all and through all the innocent whiteness, dark spots and blotches and smears of blood showed upon head and arm and shirt. Levi raised himself upon his elbow and looked scowlingly around at the amazed, wonder-struck faces surrounding him. "Why, it's Levi West!" croaked the squire, at last finding his voice. Then suddenly Lieutenant Maynard pushed forward, before the others crowded around the figure on the floor, and clutching Levi by the hair, dragged his head backward so as to better see his face. "Levi West!" said he in a loud voice. "Is this the Levi West you've been telling me of? Look at that scar and mark on his cheek. This is Blueskin himself." Subchapter 14. In the chest which Blueskin had dug up out of the sand were found not only the goldsmith's bills taken from the packet, but also many other valuables belonging to the officers and the passengers of the unfortunate ship. The New York agents offered Hiram a handsome reward for his efforts in recovering the lost bills, but Hiram declined it, positively and finally. "All I want," said he, in his usual dull, stolid fashion, "is to have folks know I'm honest." Nevertheless, though he did not accept what the agents of the packet offered, fate took the matter into its own hands and rewarded him not unsubstantially. Blueskin was taken to England in the Scorpion, but he never came to trial. While in Newgate he hanged himself to the cell window with his own stockings. The news of his end was brought to Lewes in the early autumn, and Squire Hall took immediate measures to have the £500 of his father's legacy duly transferred to Hiram. In November Hiram married the pirate's widow. End of section 14.
Section 15 of Howard Pyle's Book of Pirates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. Howard Pyle's Book of Pirates by Howard Pyle. Compiled by Merrill Johnson. Chapter 7. Captain Scarfield. Preface. The author of this narrative cannot recall that, in any history of the famous pirates, he has ever read a detailed and sufficient account of the life and death of Captain John Scarfield. Doubtless some data concerning his death and the destruction of his schooner might be gathered from the report of Lieutenant Mannering, now filed in the archives of the Navy Department, but beyond such bald and bloodless narrative the author knows of nothing, unless it be the little chapbook history published by Isaiah Thomas in Newburyport about the year 1821-22, entitled A True History of the Life and Death of Captain Jack Scarfield. This lack of particularity in the history of one so notable in his profession, it is the design of the present narrative in a measure to supply; and, if the author has seen fit to cast it in the form of a fictional story, it is only that it may make more easy reading for those who see fit to follow the tale from this to its conclusion. Captain Scarfield. Section 1. Eleazer Cooper, or Captain Cooper, as was his better known title in Philadelphia, was a prominent member of the Society of Friends. He was an overseer of the meeting and an occasional speaker upon particular occasions. When at home from one of his many voyages, he never failed to occupy his seat in the meeting both on first day and fifth day, and he was regarded by his fellow townsmen as a model of business integrity and of domestic responsibility. More incidental to this history, however, it is to be narrated that Captain Cooper was one of those trading skippers who carried their own merchandise in their own vessels, which they sailed themselves, and on whose decks they did their own bartering. His vessel was a swift, large schooner, the Eliza Cooper, of Philadelphia, named for his wife. His cruising grounds were the West India Islands, and his merchandise was flour and corn meal ground at the Brandywine Mills at Wilmington, Delaware. During the War of 1812 he had earned, as was very well known, an extraordinary fortune in his trading. For flour and corn meal sold at fabulous prices in the French, Spanish, Dutch, and Danish islands, cut off, as they were, from the rest of the world by the British blockade. The running of this blockade was one of the most hazardous maritime ventures possible, but Captain Cooper had met with such unvaried success, and had sold his merchandise at such incredible profit that, at the end of the war, he found himself to have become one of the wealthiest merchants of his native city. It was known at one time that his balance in the Mechanics' Bank was greater than that of any other individual depositor upon the books, and it was told of him that he had once deposited in the bank a chest of foreign silver coin, the exchanged value of which, when translated into American currency, was upward of $42,000, a prodigious sum of money in those days. In person Captain Cooper was tall and angular of frame. His face was thin and severe, wearing continually an unsmiling, mask-like expression of continent and unruffled sobriety. His manner was dry and taciturn, and his conduct and life were measured to the most absolute accord with the teaching of his religious belief. He lived in an old-fashioned house on Front Street below Spruce, as pleasant, cheerful a house as ever a trading captain could return to. At the back of the house a lawn sloped steeply down toward the river. To the south stood the wharf and storehouses; to the north an orchard and kitchen garden bloomed with abundant verdure. Two large chestnut trees sheltered the porch and the little space of lawn, and when you sat under them in the shade you looked down the slope between two rows of box bushes directly across the shining river to the Jersey shore. At the time of our story, that is, about the year 1820, this property had increased very greatly in value, but it was the old home of the Coopers, as Eleazer Cooper was entirely rich enough to indulge his fancy in such matters. Accordingly, as he chose to live in the same house where his father and his grandfather had dwelt before him, he peremptorily, if quietly, refused all offers looking toward the purchase of the lot of ground, though it was now worth 5 or 6 times its former value. As was said, it was a cheerful, pleasant home, impressing you, when you entered it, with a feeling of spotless and all-pervading cleanliness, a cleanliness that greeted you in the shining brass door-knocker, that entertained you in the sitting-room with its stiff, leather-covered furniture, the brass-headed tacks whereof sparkled like so many stars, a cleanliness that bade you farewell in the spotless stretch of sand-sprinkled hallway, the wooden floor of which was worn into knobs around the nail-heads by the countless scorings and scrubbings to which it had been subjected, and which left behind them an all-pervading faint, fragrant odour of soap and warm water. Eleazer Cooper and his wife were childless, but one inmate made the great, silent, shady house bright with life. Lucinda Fairbanks, a niece of Captain Cooper's by his only sister, was a handsome, sprightly girl of 18 or 20, and a great favourite in the Quaker society of the city. It remains only to introduce the final, and perhaps the most important actor of the narrative, Lieutenant James Mannering. During the past 12 months or so he had been a frequent visitor at the Cooper house. At this time he was a broad-shouldered, red-cheeked, stalwart fellow of 26 or 28. He was a great social favourite, and possessed the added romantic interest of having been aboard the Constitution when she fought the Guerrière, and of having with his own hands touched the match that fired the first gun of that great battle. Mannering's mother and Eliza Cooper had always been intimate friends, and the coming and going of the young man during his leave of absence were looked upon in the house as quite a matter of course. Half a dozen times a week he would drop in to execute some little commission for the ladies, or, if Captain Cooper was at home, to smoke a pipe of tobacco with him, to sip a dram of his famous old Jamaica rum, or to play a rubber of checkers of an evening. It is not likely that either of the older people was the least aware of the real cause of his visits. Still less did they suspect that any passages of sentiment had passed between the young people. The truth was that Mannering and the young lady were very deeply in love. It was a love that they were obliged to keep a profound secret, for not only had Eleazer Cooper held the strictest sort of testimony against the late war, a testimony so rigorous as to render it altogether unlikely that one of so military a profession as Mannering practised could hope for his consent to a suit for marriage, but Lucinda could not have married one not a member of the Society of Friends without losing her own birthright membership therein. She herself might not attach much weight to such a loss of membership in the society, but her fear of and her respect for her uncle led her to walk very closely in her path of duty in this respect. Accordingly she and Mannering met as they could, clandestinely, and the stolen moments were very sweet. With equal secrecy Lucinda had, at the request of her lover, sat for a miniature portrait to Mrs. Gregory, which miniature, set in a gold medallion, Mannering, with a mild, sentimental pleasure, wore hung around his neck and beneath his shirt frill next his heart. In the month of April of the year 1820, Mannering received orders to report at Washington. During the preceding autumn the West India pirates, and notably Captain Jack Scarfield, had been more than usually active, and the loss of the packet Marblehead, which, sailing from Charleston, South Carolina, was never heard of more, was attributed to them. 2 other coasting vessels off the coast of Georgia had been looted and burned by Scarfield, and the Government had at last aroused itself to the necessity of active measures for repressing these pests of the West India waters. Mannering received orders to take command of the Yankee, a swift, light draught, heavily armed brig of war, and to cruise about the Bahama Islands and to capture and destroy all the pirates' vessels he could there discover. On his way from Washington to New York, where the Yankee was then waiting orders, Mannering stopped in Philadelphia to bid good-bye to his many friends in that city. He called at the old Cooper house. It was on a Sunday afternoon. The spring was early, and the weather extremely pleasant that day, being filled with a warmth almost as of summer. The apple trees were already in full bloom, and filled all the air with their fragrance. Everywhere there seemed to be the pervading hum of bees, and the drowsy, tepid sunshine was very delightful. At that time Eleazer was just home from an unusually successful voyage to Antigua. Mannering found the family sitting under one of the still leafless chestnut trees, Captain Cooper smoking his long clay pipe and lazily perusing a copy of the National Gazette. Eleazer listened with a great deal of interest to what Mannering had to say of his proposed cruise. He himself knew a great deal about the pirates, and, singularly unbending from his moral, stiff taciturnity, he began telling of what he knew, particularly of Captain Scarfield, in whom he appeared to take an extraordinary interest. Vastly to Mannering's surprise, the old Quaker assumed the position of a defendant of the pirates, protesting that the wickedness of the accused was enormously exaggerated. He declared that he knew some of the freebooters very well, and that at the most they were poor, misdirected wretches, who had by easy gradation slid into their present evil ways, from having been tempted by the Government authorities to enter into privateering in the days of the late war. He conceded that Captain Scarfield had done many cruel and wicked deeds, but he averred that he had also performed many kind and benevolent actions. The world made no note of these latter, but took care only to condemn the evil that had been done. He acknowledged that it was true that the pirate had allowed his crew to cast lots for the wife and the daughter of the skipper of the Northern Rose, but there were none of his accusers who told how, at the risk of his own life and the lives of all his crew, he had given succour to the schooner Halifax, found adrift with all hands down with yellow fever. There was no defender of his actions to tell how he and his crew of pirates had sailed the pest-stricken vessel almost into the rescuing waters of Kingston Harbour. Eleazer confessed that he could not deny that when Scarfield had tied the skipper of the Baltimore Belle naked to the foremast of his own brig, he had permitted his crew of cut-throats, who were drunk at the time, to throw bottles at the helpless captive, who died that night of the wounds he had received. For this he was doubtless very justly condemned, but who was there to praise him, when he had, at the risk of his life and in the face of the authorities, carried a cargo of provisions which he himself had purchased at Tampa Bay to the island of Bella Vista after the great hurricane of 1818. In this notable adventure he had barely escaped, after a 2 days' chase, the British frigate Ceres, whose captain, had a capture been effected, would instantly have hung the unfortunate man to the yard-arm, in spite of the beneficent mission he was in the act of conducting. In all this, Eleazer had the air of conducting the case for the defendant. As he talked, he became more and more animated and voluble. The light went out in his tobacco pipe, and a hectic spot appeared in either thin and sallow cheek. Mainwaring sat wondering to hear the severely peaceful Quaker preacher defending so notoriously bloody and cruel a cut-throat pirate as Captain Jack Scarfield. The warm and innocent surroundings, the old brick house looking down upon them, the odour of apple blossoms and the hum of bees seemed to make it all the more incongruous. And still the elderly Quaker skipper talked on and on with hardly an interruption, till the warm sun slanted to the west and the day began to decline. That evening Mainwaring stayed to tea, and when he parted from Lucinda Fairbanks it was after nightfall, with a clear round moon shining in the milky sky, and a radiance pallid and unreal enveloping the old house, the blooming apple trees, the sloping lawn, and the shining river beyond. He implored his sweetheart to let him tell her uncle and aunt of their acknowledged love, and to ask the old man's consent to it, but she would not permit him to do so. They were so happy as they were. Who knew but what her uncle might forbid their fondness? Would he not wait a little longer? Maybe it would all come right after a while. She was so fond, so tender, so tearful at the nearness of their parting, that he had not the heart to insist. At the same time it was with a feeling almost of despair that he realized that he must now be gone, maybe for the space of 2 years, without in all that time possessing the right to call her his before the world. When he bade farewell to the older people, it was with a choking feeling of bitter disappointment. He yet felt the pressure of her cheek against his shoulder, the touch of soft and velvet lips to his own. But what were such clandestine endearments compared to what might, perchance, be his, the right of calling her his own when he was far away and upon the distant sea? And, besides, he felt like a coward who had shirked his duty. But he was very much in love. The next morning appeared in a drizzle of rain that followed the beautiful warmth of the day before. He had the coach all to himself, and in the damp and leathery solitude he drew out the little oval picture from beneath his shirt frill, and looked long and fixedly with a fond and foolish joy at the innocent face, the blue eyes, the red smiling lips depicted upon the satin-like ivory surface. Section 2. For the better part of 5 months Mainwaring cruised about in the waters surrounding the Bahama Islands. In that time he ran to earth and dispersed a dozen nests of pirates. He destroyed no less than 15 piratical crafts of all sizes, from a large half-decked whaleboat to a 300-ton barkentine, The name of the Yankee became a terror to every sea wolf in the western tropics, and the waters of the Bahama Islands became swept almost clean of the bloody wretches who had so lately infested it. But the one freebooter of all others whom he sought, Captain Jack Scarfield, seemed to evade him like a shadow, to slip through his fingers like magic. Twice he came almost within touch of the famous marauder, both times in the ominous wrecks that the pirate captain had left behind him. The first of these was the waterlogged remains of a burned and still smoking wreck that he found adrift in the great Bahama Channel. It was the Water Witch of Salem, but he did not learn her tragic story until 2 weeks later he discovered a part of her crew at Port Maria on the north coast of Jamaica. It was, indeed, a dreadful story to which he listened. The castaways said that they of all the vessel's crew had been spared so that they might tell the commander of the Yankee, should they meet him, that he might keep what he found, with Captain Scarfield's compliments, who served it up to him hot cooked. 3 weeks later he rescued what remained of the crew of the shattered, bloody hulk of the Baltimore Belle, 8 of whose crew, headed by the captain, had been tied hand and foot and heaved overboard. Again there was a message from Captain Scarfield to the commander of the Yankee, that he might season what he found to suit his own taste. Mainwaring was of a sanguine disposition, with a fiery temper. He swore with the utmost vehemence that either he or John Scarfield would have to leave the earth. He had little suspicion of how soon was to befall the ominous realization of his angry prophecy. At that time one of the chief rendezvous of the pirates was the little island of San José, one of the southernmost of the Bahama group. Here, in the days before the coming of the Yankee, they were wont to put in to careen and clean their vessels, and to take in a fresh supply of provisions, gunpowder and rum, preparatory to renewing their attacks upon the peaceful commerce circulating up and down outside the islands, or through the wide stretches of the Bahama Channel. Mainwaring had made several descents upon this nest of freebooters. He had already made 2 notable captures, and it was here he hoped eventually to capture Captain Scarfield himself. A brief description of this one-time notorious rendezvous of freebooters might not be out of place. It consisted of a little settlement of those wattled and mud-smeared houses such as you find through the West Indies. There were only 3 houses of a more pretentious sort, built of wood. One of these was a storehouse, another was a rum shop, and a third a house in which dwelt a mulatto woman who was reputed to be a sort of left-handed wife of Captain Scarfield's. The population was almost entirely black and brown. 1 or 2 Jews and a half-dozen Yankee traders of hardly dubious honesty comprised the entire white population. The rest consisted of a mongrel accumulation of negroes and mulattoes and half-caste Spaniards, and of a multitude of black or yellow women and children. The settlement stood in a bight of the beach forming a small harbour and affording a fair anchorage for small vessels, excepting it were against the beating of a southeasterly gale. The houses, or cabins, were surrounded by clusters of cocoa palms and growths of bananas, and a long curve of white beach, sheltered from the large Atlantic breakers that burst and exploded upon an outer bar, was drawn like a necklace round the semicircle of emerald green water. Such was the famous pirate settlement of San José, a paradise of nature and a hell of human depravity and wickedness, and it was to this spot that Mainwaring paid another visit a few days after rescuing the crew of the Baltimore Belle from her shattered and sinking wreck. As the little bay with its fringe of palms and its cluster of wattle huts opened up to view, Mainwaring discovered a vessel lying at anchor in the little harbour. It was a large and well-rigged schooner of 250 or 300 tons burden. As the Yankee rounded to under the stern of the stranger, and dropped anchor in such a position as to bring her broadside battery to bear should the occasion require, Mainwaring set his glass to his eye to read the name he could distinguish beneath the overhang of her stern. It is impossible to describe his infinite surprise when, the white lettering starting out in the circle of the glass, he read, "The Eliza Cooper of Philadelphia." He could not believe the evidence of his senses. Certainly this sink of iniquity was the last place in the world he would have expected to have fallen in with Eleazer Cooper. He ordered out the gig and had himself immediately rowed over to the schooner. Whatever lingering doubts he might have entertained as to the identity of the vessel were quickly dispelled when he beheld Captain Cooper himself standing at the gangway to meet him. The impassive face of the friend showed neither surprise nor confusion at what must have been to him a most unexpected encounter. But when he stepped upon the deck of the Eliza Cooper and looked about him, Mainwaring could hardly believe the evidence of his senses at the transformation that he beheld. Upon the main deck were 8 12-pound carronade neatly covered with tarpaulin. In the bow a long tom, also snugly stowed away and covered, directed a veiled and muzzled snout out over the bowsprit. It was entirely impossible for Mainwaring to conceal his astonishment at so unexpected a sight, and whether or not his own thoughts lent colour to his imagination, it seemed to him that Eleazer Cooper concealed under the immobility of his countenance no small degree of confusion. After Captain Cooper had led the way into the cabin, and he and the younger man were seated over a pipe of tobacco and the invariable bottle of fine old Jamaica rum, Mainwaring made no attempt to refrain from questioning him as to the reason for this singular and ominous transformation. "I am a man of peace, James Mainwaring," Eleazer replied, "but there are men of blood in these waters, and an appearance of great strength is of use to protect the innocent from the wicked. If I remained in appearance the peaceful trader I really am, how long does thee suppose I could remain unassailed in this place?" It occurred to Mainwaring that the powerful armament he had beheld was rather extreme to be used merely as a preventive. He smoked for a while in silence, and then he suddenly asked the other point blank whether, if it came to blows with such a one as Captain Scarfield, would he make a fight of it. The Quaker trading captain regarded him for a while in silence. His look, it seemed to Mainwaring, appeared to be dubitative as to how far he dared to be frank. "Friend James," he said at last, "I may as well acknowledge that my officers and crew are somewhat worldly. Of a truth they do not hold the same testimony as I. I am inclined to think that if it came to the point of a broil with those men of iniquity, my individual voice cast for peace would not be sufficient to keep my crew from meeting violence with violence. As for myself, thee knows who I am and what is my testimony in these matters." Mainwaring made no comment as to the extremely questionable manner in which the Quaker proposed to beat the devil about the stump. Presently he asked his second question. "And might I inquire," he said, "what you are doing here, and why you find it necessary to come at all into such a wicked, dangerous place as this?" "Indeed, I knew thee would ask that question of me," said the friend, "and I will be entirely frank with thee. These men of blood are, after all, but human beings, and as human beings they need food. I have at present upon this vessel upward of 250 barrels of flour, which will bring a higher price here than anywhere else in the West Indies. To be entirely frank with thee, I will tell thee that I was engaged in making a bargain for the sale of the greater part of my merchandise, when the news of thy approach drove away my best customer." Mainwaring sat for a while in smoking silence. What the other had told him explained many things he had not before understood. It explained why Captain Cooper got almost as much for his flour and cornmeal now that peace had been declared as he had obtained when the war and the blockade were in full swing. It explained why he had been so strong a defender of Captain Scarfield and the pirates that afternoon in the garden. Meantime, what was to be done? Eleazer confessed openly that he dealt with the pirates. What now was his, Mainwaring's, duty in the case? Was the cargo of the Eliza Cooper contraband and subject to confiscation? And then another question framed itself in his mind. Who was this customer whom his approach had driven away? As though he had formulated the inquiry into speech, the other began directly to speak of it. "I know," he said, "that in a moment thee will ask me who was this customer of whom I have just now spoken. I have no desire to conceal his name from thee. It was the man who is known as Captain Jack, or Captain John Scarfield." Mainwaring fairly started from his seat. "The devil you say!" he cried. "And how long has it been," he asked, "since he left you?" The Quaker skipper carefully refilled his pipe, which he had by now smoked out. "I would judge," he said, "that it is a matter of 4 or 5 hours since news was brought overland by means of swift runners of thy approach. Immediately the man of wickedness disappeared." Here Eleazer set the bowl of his pipe to the candle flame and began puffing out voluminous clouds of smoke. "I would have thee understand, James Mainwaring," he resumed, "that I am no friend of this wicked and sinful man. His safety is nothing to me. It is only a question of buying upon his part and of selling upon mine. If it is any satisfaction to thee, I will heartily promise to bring thee news if I hear anything of the man of Belial. I may furthermore say that I think it is likely thee will have news more or less directly of him within the space of a day. If this should happen, however, thee will have to do thy own fighting without help from me, for I am no man of combat nor of blood, and will take no hand in it either way." It struck Mainwaring that the words contained some meaning that did not appear upon the surface. This significance struck him as so ambiguous that when he went aboard the Yankee he confided as much of his suspicions as he saw fit to his second in command, Lieutenant Underwood. As night descended he had a double watch set and had everything prepared to repel any attack or surprise that might be attempted. Section 16 of Howard Pyle's Book of Pirates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. Howard Pyle's Book of Pirates by Howard Pyle. Compiled by Merle Johnson. Section 16. Captain Scarfield, Part 2. Subchapter 3. Nighttime in the tropics descends with a surprising rapidity. At one moment the earth is shining with the brightness of the twilight. The next, as it were, all things are suddenly swallowed into a gulf of darkness. The particular night of which this story treats was not entirely clear. The time of year was about the approach of the rainy season, and the tepid tropical clouds added obscurity to the darkness of the sky, so that the night fell with even more startling quickness than usual. The blackness was very dense. Now and then a group of drifting stars swam out of a rift in the vapours, but the night was curiously silent and of a velvety darkness. As the obscurity had deepened, Mainwaring had ordered lanterns to be lighted and slung to the shrouds and to the stays, and the faint yellow of their illumination lighted the level white of the snug little war vessel, gleaming here and there in a star-like spark upon the brass trimmings and causing the rows of cannons to assume curiously gigantic proportions. For some reason Mainwaring was possessed by a strange, uneasy feeling. He walked restlessly up and down the deck for a time, and then, still full of anxieties for he knew not what, went into his cabin to finish writing up his log for the day. He unstrapped his cutlass and laid it upon the table, lighted his pipe at the lantern, and was about preparing to lay aside his coat when word was brought to him that the captain of the trading schooner was come alongside and had some private information to communicate to him. Mainwaring surmised in an instant that the trader's visit related somehow to news of Captain Scarfield, and as immediately, in the relief of something positive to face, all of his feeling of restlessness vanished like a shadow of mist. He gave orders that Captain Cooper should be immediately shown into the cabin, and in a few moments the tall, angular form of the Quaker skipper appeared in the narrow, lantern-lighted space. Mainwaring at once saw that his visitor was strangely agitated and disturbed. He had taken off his hat, and shining beads of perspiration had gathered and stood clustered upon his forehead. He did not reply to Mainwaring's greeting. He did not, indeed, seem to hear it, but he came directly forward to the table and stood leaning with one hand upon the open logbook in which the lieutenant had just been writing. Mainwaring had reseated himself at the head of the table, and the tall figure of the skipper stood looking down at him as from a considerable height. "James Mainwaring," he said, "I promised thee to report if I had news of the pirate. Is thee ready now to hear my news?" There was something so strange in his agitation that it began to infect Mainwaring with a feeling somewhat akin to that which appeared to disturb his visitor. "I know not what you mean, sir," he cried, "by asking if I care to hear your news. At this moment I would rather have news of that scoundrel than to have anything I know of in the world." "Thou would? Thou would?" cried the other with mounting agitation. "Is thee in such haste to meet him as all that? Very well then. Suppose I could bring you face to face with him. What then, eh? Eh? Face to face with him, James Mannering." The thought instantly flashed into Mannering's mind that the pirate had returned to the island, that perhaps at that moment he was somewhere near at hand. "I do not understand you, sir," he cried. "Do you mean to tell me that you know where the villain is? If so, lose no time in informing me, for every instant of delay may mean his chance of again escaping." "No danger of that," the other declared, vehemently. "No danger of that. I'll tell thee where he is, and I'll bring thee to him quick enough." And as he spoke he thumped his fist against the open logbook. In the vehemence of his growing excitement his eyes appeared to shine green in the lanthorn light, and the sweat that had stood in beads upon his forehead was now running in streams down his face. One drop hung like a jewel to the tip of his beak-like nose. He came a step nearer to Mannering and bent forward toward him, and there was something so strange and ominous in his bearing that the lieutenant instinctively drew back a little where he sat. "Captain Scarfield sent something to you," said Eleazer almost in a raucous voice. "Something that you will be surprised to see." And the lapse in his speech from the Quaker thee to the plural you struck Mannering as singularly strange. As he was speaking, Eleazer was fumbling in a pocket of his long-tailed drab coat, and presently he brought something forth that gleamed in the lanthorn light. The next moment Mannering saw levelled directly in his face the round and hollow nozzle of a pistol. There was an instant of dead silence, and then "I am the man you seek," said Eleazer Cooper, in a tense and breathless voice. The whole thing had happened so instantaneously and unexpectedly that for the moment Mannering sat like one petrified. Had a thunderbolt fallen from the silent sky and burst at his feet, he could not have been more stunned. He was like one held in the meshes of a horrid nightmare, and he gazed as through a mist of impossibility into the lineaments of the well-known sober face now transformed as from within into the aspect of a devil. That face, now ashy white, was distorted into a diabolical grin. The teeth glistened in the lamplight. The brows, twisted into a tense and convulsed frown, were drawn down into black shadows, through which the eyes burned a baleful green like the eyes of a wild animal driven to bay. Again he spoke in the same breathless voice. "I am John Scarfield. Look at me then, if you want to see a pirate." Again there was a little time of silence, through which Mannering heard his watch ticking loudly from where it hung against the bulkhead. Then once more the other began speaking. "You would chase me out of the West Indies, would you? God, you! What are you come to now? You're caught in your own trap, and you'll squeal loud enough before you get out of it. Speak a word or make a movement, and I'll blow your brains out against the partition behind you. Listen to what I say, or you are a dead man. Sing out an order instantly for my mate and my bo'sun to come here to the cabin, and be quick about it, for my finger's on the trigger, and it's only a pull to shut your mouth forever." It was astonishing to Mannering, in afterward thinking about it all, how quickly his mind began to recover its steadiness after that first astonishing shock. Even as the other was speaking, he discovered that his brain was becoming clarified to a wonderful lucidity. His thoughts were becoming rearranged, and with a marvellous activity and an alertness he had never before experienced. He knew that if he moved to escape or uttered any outcry, he would be instantly a dead man, for the circle of the pistol barrel was directed full against his forehead and with the steadiness of a rock. If he could but for an instant divert that fixed and deadly attention, he might still have a chance for life. With the thought an inspiration burst into his mind, and he instantly put it into execution. Thought, inspiration, and action, as in a flash, were one. He must make the other turn aside his deadly gaze, and instantly he roared out in a voice that stunned his own ears, "Strike, bo'sun! Strike, quick!" Taken by surprise, and thinking, doubtless, that another enemy stood behind him, the pirate swung around like a flash with his pistol levelled against the blank boarding. Equally upon the instant he saw the trick that had been played upon him, and in a second flash had turned again. The turn and return had occupied but a moment of time, but that moment, thanks to the readiness of his own invention, had undoubtedly saved Mannering's life. As the other turned away his gaze for that brief instant, Mannering leapt forward and upon him. There was a flashing flame of fire as the pistol was discharged, and a deafening detonation that seemed to split his brain. For a moment, with reeling senses, he supposed himself to have been shot. The next he knew he had escaped. With the energy of despair he swung his enemy around and drove him with prodigious violence against the corner of the table. The pirate emitted a grunting cry, and then they fell together, Mainwaring upon the top, and the pistol clattered with them to the floor in their fall. Even as he fell, Mainwaring roared in a voice of thunder, "All hands repel boarders!" and then again, "All hands repel boarders!" Whether hurt by the table edge or not, the fallen pirate struggled as though possessed of 40 devils, and in a moment or two Mainwaring saw the shine of a long keen knife that he had drawn from somewhere about his person. The lieutenant caught him by the wrist, but the other's muscles were as though made of steel. They both fought in despairing silence, the one to carry out his frustrated purposes to kill, the other to save his life. Again and again Mainwaring felt that the knife had been thrust against him, piercing once his arm, once his shoulder, and again his neck. He felt the warm blood streaming down his arm and body, and looked about him in despair. The pistol lay near upon the deck of the cabin. Still holding the other by the wrist as he could, Mainwaring snatched up the empty weapon and struck once and again at the bald narrow forehead beneath him. A third blow he delivered with all the force he could command, and then with a violent and convulsive throe the straining muscles beneath him relaxed and grew limp, and the fight was won. Through all the struggle he had been aware of the shouts of voices, of trampling of feet and discharge of firearms, and the thought came to him, even through his own danger, that the Yankee was being assaulted by the pirates. As he felt the struggling form beneath him loosen and dissolve into quietude, he leaped up and snatching his cutlass, which still lay upon the table, rushed out upon the deck, leaving the stricken form lying twitching upon the floor behind him. It was a fortunate thing that he had set double watches and prepared himself for some attack from the pirates, otherwise the Yankee would certainly have been lost. As it was, the surprise was so overwhelming that the pirates, who had been concealed in a large whaleboat that had come alongside, were not only able to gain a foothold upon the deck, but for a time it seemed as though they would drive the crew of the brig below the hatches. But as Mainwaring, streaming with blood, rushed out upon the deck, the pirates became immediately aware that their own captain must have been overpowered, and in an instant their desperate energy began to evaporate. One or two jumped overboard. One, who seemed to be the mate, fell dead from a pistol shot, and then in the turn of a hand there was a rush of a retreat and a vision of leaping forms in the dusky light of the lanthorns, and a sound of splashing in the water below. The crew of the Yankee continued firing at the phosphorescent wakes of the swimming bodies, but whether with effect it was impossible at the time to tell. Subchapter 4. The pirate captain did not die immediately. He lingered for 3 or 4 days, now and then unconscious, now and then semi-conscious, but always deliriously wandering. All the while he thus lay dying, the mulatto woman, with whom he had lived in this part of his extraordinary dual existence, nursed and cared for him with such rude attentions as the surroundings afforded. In the wanderings of his mind the same duality of life followed him. Now and then he would appear the calm, sober, self-contained, well-ordered member of a peaceful society that his friends in his faraway home knew him to be. At other times the nether part of his nature would leap up into life like a wild beast, furious and gnashing. At the one time he talked evenly and clearly of peaceful things. At the other time he blasphemed and hooted with fury. Several times Mainwaring, though racked by his own wounds, sat beside the dying man through the silent watches of the tropical nights. Oftentimes upon these occasions, as he looked at the thin, lean face babbling and talking so aimlessly, he wondered what it all meant. Could it have been madness? Madness in which the separate entities of good and bad each had, in its turn, a perfect and distinct existence? He chose to think that this was the case. Who, within his inner consciousness, does not feel that same ferine, savage man struggling against the stern, adamantine bonds of morality and decorum? Were those bonds burst asunder, as it was with this man, might not the wild beast rush forth, as it had rushed forth in him, to rend and to tear? Such were the questions that Mainwaring asked himself. And how had it all come about? By what easy gradations had the respectable Quaker skipper descended from the decorum of his home life, step by step, into such a gulf of iniquity? Many such thoughts passed through Mainwaring's mind, and he pondered them through the still reaches of the tropical nights, while he sat watching the pirate captain struggle out of the world he had so long burdened. At last the poor wretch died, and the earth was well quit of one of its torments. A systematic search was made through the island for the scattered crew, but none was captured. Either there were some secret hiding places upon the island, which was not very likely, or else they had escaped in boats hidden somewhere among the tropical foliage. At any rate, they were gone. Nor, search as he would, could Mainwaring find a trace of any of the pirate treasure. After the pirate's death and under close questioning, the weeping mulatto woman so far broke down as to confess in broken English that Captain Scarfield had taken a quantity of silver money aboard his vessel, but either she was mistaken or else the pirates had taken it thence again and had hidden it somewhere else. Nor would the treasure ever have been found but for a most fortuitous accident. Mainwaring had given orders that the Eliza Cooper was to be burned, and a party was detailed to carry the order into execution. At this the cook of the Yankee came petitioning for some of the Wilmington and Brandywine flour to make some plum duff upon the morrow, and Mainwaring granted his request in so far that he ordered one of the men to knock open one of the barrels of flour and to supply the cook's demands. The crew detailed to execute this modest order in connection with the destruction of the pirate vessel had not been gone a quarter of an hour when word came back that the hidden treasure had been found. Mainwaring hurried aboard the Eliza Cooper, and there, in the midst of the open flour barrel, he beheld a great quantity of silver coin buried in and partly covered by the white meal. A systematic search was now made. One by one the flour barrels were heaved up from below and burst open on the deck, and their contents searched, and if nothing but the meal was found it was swept overboard. The breeze was whitened with clouds of flour, and the white meal covered the surface of the ocean for yards around. In all, upward of $150,000 was found concealed beneath the innocent flour and meal. It was no wonder the pirate captain was so successful, when he could upon an instant's notice transform himself from a wolf of the ocean to a peaceful Quaker trader selling flour to the hungry towns and settlements among the scattered islands of the West Indies, and so carrying his bloody treasure safely into his quiet northern home. In concluding this part of the narrative, it may be added that a white strip of canvas painted black was discovered in the hold of the Eliza Cooper. Upon it, in great white letters, was painted the name "The Bloodhound." Undoubtedly this was used upon occasions to cover the real and peaceful title of the trading schooner, just as its captain had, in reverse, covered his sanguine and cruel life by a thin sheet of morality and respectability. This is the true story of the death of Captain Jack Scarfield. The Newburyport chapbook, of which I have already spoken, speaks only of how the pirate disguised himself upon the ocean as a Quaker trader. Nor is it likely that anyone ever identified Eleazer Cooper with the pirate, for only Mainwaring of all the crew of the Yankee was exactly aware of the true identity of Captain Scarfield. All that was ever known to the world was that Eleazer Cooper had been killed in a fight with the pirates. In a little less than a year Mainwaring was married to Lucinda Fairbanks. As to Eleazer Cooper's fortune, which eventually came into the possession of Mainwaring through his wife, it was many times a subject of speculation to the lieutenant how it had been earned. There were times when he felt well assured that a part of it at least was the fruit of piracy, but it was entirely impossible to guess how much more was the result of legitimate trading. For a little time it seemed to Mainwaring that he should give it all up, but this was at once so impracticable and so quixotic that he presently abandoned it, and in time his qualms and misdoubts faded away, and he settled himself down to enjoy that which had come to him through his marriage. In time the Mainwarings removed to New York, and ultimately the fortune that the pirate Scarfield had left behind him was used in part to found the great shipping house of Mainwaring and Bigot, whose famous transatlantic packet ships were in their time the admiration of the whole world. End of chapter 7 and end of section 16.
Section 17 of Howard Pyle's Book of Pirates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Schneider. Howard Pyle's Book of Pirates by Howard Pyle. Compiled by Merle Johnson. The Ruby of Kishmoor, Part 1. Prologue. A very famous pirate of his day was Captain Robertson Kite. Before embarking upon his later career of infamy, he was in the beginning very well known as a reputable merchant in the island of Jamaica. Thence entering first of all upon the business of the African trade, he presently by regular degrees became a pirate, and finally ended his career as one of the most renowned freebooters of history. The remarkable adventure through which he at once reached the pinnacle of success, and became in his profession the most famous figure of his day, was the capture of the Rajah of Kishmoor's great ship, the Sun of the East. In this vessel was the Rajah's favorite queen, who, together with her attendants, was set upon a pilgrimage to Mecca. The court of this great Oriental potentate was, as may be readily supposed, fairly aglitter with gold and jewels, so that what with such personal adornments that the queen and her attendants had fetched with them, besides an ample treasury for the expenses of the expedition, an incredible prize of gold and jewels rewarded the freebooters for their successful adventure. Among the precious stones taken in this great purchase was the splendid ruby of Kishmoor. This, as may be known to the reader, was one of the world's greatest gems, and was unique alike both for its prodigious size and the splendor of its color. The precious jewel the Rajah of Kishmoor had, upon a certain occasion, bestowed upon his queen, and at the time of her capture she wore it as the centerpiece of a sort of coronet which encircled her forehead and brow. The seizure by the pirate of so considerable a person as that of the Queen of Kishmoor, and of the enormous treasure that he found aboard her ship, would alone have been sufficient to have established his fame. But the capture of so extraordinary a prize as that of the ruby, which was in itself worth the value of an entire Oriental kingdom, exalted him at once to the very highest pinnacle of renown. Having achieved the capture of this incredible prize, our captain scuttled the great ship and left her to sink with all on board. 3 Lascars of the crew alone escaped to bear the news of this tremendous disaster to an astounded world. As may readily be supposed, it was now no longer possible for Captain Kite to hope to live in such comparative obscurity as he had before enjoyed. His was now too remarkable a figure in the eyes of the world. Several expeditions from various parts were immediately fitted out against him, and it presently became no longer compatible with his safety to remain thus clearly outlined before the eyes of the world. Accordingly, he immediately set about seeking such security as he might now hope to find, which he did the more readily since he had now, at one cast, so entirely fulfilled his most sanguine expectations of good fortune and of fame. Thereafter, accordingly, the adventures of our captain became of a more apocryphal sort. It was known that he reached the West Indies in safety, for he was once seen at Port Royal and twice at Spanish Town in the island of Jamaica. Thereafter, however, he disappeared, nor was it until several years later that the world heard anything concerning him. One day a certain Nicholas Duckworthy, who had once been gunner aboard the pirate captain's own ship, the Good Fortune, was arrested in the town of Bristol in the very act of attempting to sell to a merchant of that place several valuable gems from a quantity which he carried with him tied in a red bandana handkerchief. In the confession of which Duckworthy afterward delivered himself, he declared that Captain Kite, after his first adventure, having sailed from Africa in safety, and so reached the shores of the New World, had wrecked the Good Fortune on a coral reef off the Windward Islands; that he then immediately deserted the ship, and together with Duckworthy himself, a sailing master who was Portuguese, the captain of a brig, the Bloody Hand, a consort of Kite's, and a villainous rascal named Hunt, who, occupying no precise position among the pirates, was at once the instigator of, and the partaker in, the greatest part of Captain Kite's wickednesses, made his way to the nearest port of safety. These 5 worthies at last fetched the island of Jamaica, bringing with them all the jewels and some of the gold that had been captured from the Sun of the East. But upon coming to a division of their booty, it was presently discovered that the Rajah's ruby had mysteriously disappeared from the collection of jewels to be divided. The other pirates immediately suspected their captain of having secretly purloined it, and indeed so certain were they of his turpitude that they immediately set about taking means to force a confession from him. In this, however, they were so far unsuccessful that the captain, refusing to yield to their importunities, had suffered himself to die under their hands, and so had carried the secret of the hiding place of the great ruby, if he possessed such a secret, along with him. Duckworthy concluded his confession by declaring that in his opinion he himself, the Portuguese sailing master, the captain of the Bloody Hand, and Hunt were the only ones of Captain Kite's crew who were now alive, for that the Good Fortune must have broken up in a storm, which immediately followed their desertion of her, in which event the entire crew must inevitably have perished. It may be added that Duckworthy himself was shortly hanged, so that, if his surmise was true, there were now only 3 left alive of all that wicked crew that had successfully carried to its completion the greatest adventure which any pirate in the world had ever perhaps embarked upon. 1. Jonathan Rugg. You may never know what romantic aspirations may lie hidden beneath the most sedate and sober demeanor. To have observed Jonathan Rugg, who was a tall, lean, loose-jointed young Quaker of a somewhat forbidding aspect, with straight dark hair and a bony overhanging forehead set into a frown, a pair of small deep-set eyes, and a square jaw, no one would for a moment have suspected that he concealed beneath so serious an exterior any appetite for romantic adventure. Nevertheless, finding himself suddenly transported, as it were, from the quiet of so sober a town as that of Philadelphia to the tropical enchantment of Kingston in the island of Jamaica, the night brilliant with a full moon that swung in an opal sky, the warm and luminous darkness replete with the mysteries of a tropical night, and burdened with the odors of a land breeze, he suddenly discovered himself to be overtaken with so vehement a desire of some unwonted excitement that, had the opportunity presented itself, he felt himself ready to embrace any adventure with the utmost eagerness, no matter whither it would have conducted him. At home, where he was a clerk in the counting-house of a leading merchant by name Jeremiah Doolittle, should such idle fancies have come to him, he would have looked upon himself as little better than a fool. But now that he found himself for the first time in a foreign country, surrounded by such strange and unusual sights and sounds, all conducive to extravagant imaginations, the wish for some extraordinary and altogether unusual experience took possession of him with a singular vehemence to which he had heretofore been altogether a stranger. In the street where he stood, which was of a shining whiteness, and which reflected the effulgence of the moonlight with an incredible distinction, he observed, stretching before him, long lines of white garden walls, overtopped by a prodigious luxuriance of tropical foliage. In these gardens, and set close to the street, stood several pretentious villas and mansions, the slatted blinds and curtains of the windows of which were raised to admit of the freer entrance of the cool and balmy air of the night. From within there issued forth bright lights, together with the exhilarating sound of merry voices laughing and talking, or perhaps a song accompanied by the tinkling music of a spinet or of a guitar. An occasional group of figures, clad in light and summer-like garments, and adorned with gay and startling colors, passed him through the moonlight. So that what with the brightness and warmth of the night, together with all these unusual sights and sounds, it appeared to Jonathan Rugg that he was rather the inhabitant of some extraordinary land of enchantment and unreality than a dweller upon that sober and solid world in which he had heretofore passed his entire existence. Before continuing this narrative, the reader may here be informed that our hero had come into this enchanted world as the supercargo of the ship Susanna Hayes of Philadelphia. that he had for several years proved himself so honest and industrious a servant to the merchant house of the worthy Jeremiah Doolittle, that that benevolent man had given to his well-deserving clerk this opportunity at once of gratifying an inclination for foreign travel, and of filling a position of trust which should redound to his individual profit. The Susanna Hayes had entered Kingston Harbor that afternoon, and this was Jonathan's first night in those tropical latitudes, whither his fancy and imagination had so often carried him while he stood over the desk filing the accounts of invoices from foreign parts. It may be finally added that had he at all conceived how soon and to what a degree his sudden inclination for adventure was to be gratified, his romantic aspirations might have been somewhat dashed at the prospect that lay before him. 2. The Mysterious Lady with the Silver Veil. At that moment our hero suddenly became conscious of the fact that a small wicket in a wooden gate near which he stood had been opened, and that the eyes of an otherwise concealed countenance were observing him with the utmost closeness of scrutiny. He had hardly time to become aware of this observation of his person when the gate itself was opened, and there appeared before him in the moonlight the bent and crooked figure of an aged negress. She was clad in a calamanco raiment, and was further adorned with a variety of gaudily colored trimmings, vastly suggestive of the tropical world of which she was an inhabitant. Her woolly head was enveloped, after the fashion of her people, in the folds of a gigantic and flaming red turban constructed of an entire pocket handkerchief. Her face was pock-pitted to an incredible degree, so that what with this deformity, emphasized by the pouting of her prodigious and shapeless lips, and the rolling of a pair of eyes as yellow as saffron, Jonathan Rugg thought that he had never beheld a figure at once so extraordinary and so repulsive. It occurred to our hero that here, maybe, was to overtake him such an adventure as that which he had just a moment before been desiring so ardently. Nor was he mistaken, for the negress, first looking this way and then that with an extremely wary and cunning expression, and apparently having satisfied herself that the street for the moment was pretty empty of passers, beckoned to him to draw nearer. When he had approached close enough to her, she caught him by the sleeve, and instantly drawing him into the garden beyond, shut and bolted the gate with a quickness and a silence suggestive of the most extravagant secrecy. At the same moment a huge negro suddenly appeared from the shadow of the gate-post, and so placed himself between Jonathan and the gate that any attempt to escape would inevitably have entailed conflict upon our hero's part with the sable and giant guardian. Says the negress, looking very intently at our hero, "Be you afeard, buckra?" "Why, no," quoth Jonathan, "for to tell thee the truth, friend, though I am a man of peace, being of that religious order known as the Society of Friends, I am not so weak in person nor so timid in disposition as to warrant me in being afraid of any one. Indeed, were I of a mind to escape, I might, without boasting, declare my belief that I should be able to push my way past even a better man than thy large friend, who stands so threateningly in front of yonder gate." At these words the negress broke into so prodigious a grin that in the moonlight it appeared as though the whole lower part of her face had been transformed into shining teeth. "You be a brave buckra," said she, in her gibbering English. "You come wid Melina, and Melina take you to pretty lady, who want you to eat supper wid her." Thereupon, and allowing our hero no opportunity to decline the extraordinary invitation, even had he been of a mind to do so, she took him by the hand and led him toward the large and imposing house which commanded the garden. "Indeed," said Jonathan to himself as he followed his sable guide, himself followed in turn by the gigantic negro, "indeed, I am like to have my fill of adventure, if anything is to be judged from such a beginning as this." Nor did the interior sumptuousness of the mansion at all belie the imposing character of its exterior. for entering by way of an illuminated veranda, and so coming into a brilliantly lighted hallway beyond, Jonathan beheld himself to be surrounded by such a wealth of exquisite and well appointed tastefulness as it had never before been his good fortune to behold. Candles of clarified wax sparkled like stars in chandeliers of crystal. These in turn, catching the illumination, glittered in prismatic fragments with all the varied colors of the rainbow, so that a mellow yet brilliant radiance filled the entire apartment. Polished mirrors of a spotless clearness, framed in gold frames and built into the walls, reflected the waxed floors, the rich oriental carpets, and the sumptuous paintings that hung against the ivory tinted paneling, so that in appearance the beauties of the apartment were continued in bewildering vistas upon every side toward which the beholder directed his gaze. Bidding our hero to be seated, which he did with no small degree of embarrassment and constraint, and upon the extreme edge of the gilt and satin covered chair, the negress who had been his conductor left him for the time being to his own contemplation. Almost before he had an opportunity to compose himself into anything more than a part of his ordinary sedatedness of demeanor, the silken curtains at the door at the other end of the apartment were suddenly divided, and Jonathan beheld before him a female figure displaying the most exquisite contour of mold and of proportion. She was clad entirely in white, and was enveloped from head to foot in the folds of a veil of delicate silver gauze, which, though hiding her countenance from recognition, nevertheless permitted sufficient of her beauties to be discerned to suggest the extreme elegance and loveliness of her lineaments. Advancing toward our hero, and extending to him a tapering hand as white as alabaster, the fingers encircled with a multitude of jeweled rings, she addressed him thus: "Sir," she said, speaking in accents of the most silvery and musical cadence, "you are no doubt vastly surprised to find yourself thus unexpectedly, and almost as by violence, introduced into the house of one who is such an entire stranger to you as myself. But though I am unknown to you, I must inform you that I am better acquainted with my visitor, for my agents have been observing you ever since you landed this afternoon at the dock, and they have followed you ever since, until a little while ago, when you stopped immediately opposite my garden gate. These agents have observed you with a closeness of scrutiny of which you are doubtless entirely unaware. They have even informed me that, owing doubtless to your extreme interest in your new surroundings, you have not as yet supped. Knowing this, and that you must now be enjoying a very hearty appetite, I have to ask you if you will do me the extreme favor of sitting at table with me at a repast which you will doubtless be surprised to learn has been hastily prepared entirely in your honor." So saying, and giving Jonathan no time for reply, she offered him her hand, and with the most polite insistence conducted him into an exquisitely appointed dining room adjoining. Here stood a table covered with a snow-white cloth, and embellished with silver and crystal ornaments of every description. Having seated herself, and having indicated to Jonathan to take the chair opposite to her, the two were presently served with a repast such as our hero had not thought could have existed out of the pages of certain extraordinary Oriental tales which one time had fallen to his lot to read. This supper, which in itself might successfully have tempted the taste of a sybarite, was further enhanced by several wines and cordials, which, filling the room with the aroma of the sunlit grapes from which they had been expressed, stimulated the appetite, which without them needed no such spur. The lady, who ate but sparingly herself, possessed herself with patience until Jonathan's hunger had been appeased. When, however, she beheld that he weakened in his attacks upon the dessert of sweets with which the banquet was concluded, she addressed him upon the business which was evidently entirely occupying her mind. "Sir," she said, "you are doubtless aware that every one, whether man or woman, is possessed of an enemy. In my own case I must inform you that I have no less than three, who, to compass their ends, would gladly sacrifice my life itself to their purposes. At no time am I safe from their machinations, nor have I anyone," she cried, exhibiting a great emotion, "to whom I may turn in my need. It was this that led me to hope to find in you a friend in my perils; for having observed through my agents that you are not only honest in disposition and strong in person, but that you are possessed of a considerable degree of energy and determination, I am most desirous of imposing upon your good nature a trust of which you cannot for a moment suspect the magnitude. Tell me, are you willing to assist a poor defenseless female in her hour of trial?" "Indeed, friend," quoth Jonathan, with more vivacity than he usually exhibited, with a lenity to which he had heretofore in his lifetime been a stranger, being warmed into such a spirit doubtless by the generous wines of which he had partaken, "indeed, friend, if I could but see thy face, it would doubtless make my decision in such a matter the more favorable, since I am inclined to think, from the little I can behold of it, that thy appearance must be extremely comely to the eye." "Sir," said the lady, exhibiting some amusement at this unexpected sally, "I am, you must know, as God made me. Some time, perhaps, I may be very glad to satisfy your curiosity and exhibit to you my poor countenance such as it is; but now," and here she reverted to her more serious mood, "I must again put it to you, are you willing to help an unprotected woman in a period of very great danger to herself? Should you decline the assistance which I solicit, my slaves shall conduct you to the gate through which you entered, and suffer you to depart in peace. Should you, upon the other hand, accept the trust, you are to receive no reward therefor, except the gratitude of one who thus appeals to you in her helplessness." For a moment Jonathan fell silent, for here indeed was he entering into an adventure which infinitely surpassed any anticipation that he could have formed. He was, besides, of a cautious nature, and was entirely disinclined to embark on any affair so obscure and tangled as that in which he now found himself becoming involved. "Friend," he said at last, "I may tell thee that thy story has so far moved me as to give me every inclination to help thee in thy difficulties. But I must also inform thee that I am a man of caution, having never before entered into any business of this sort. Therefore, before giving any promise that may bind my future actions, I must, in good wisdom, demand to know what are the conditions that thou hast in mind to impose upon me." "Indeed, sir," cried the lady, with great vivacity and with more cheerful accents, as though her mind had been relieved of a burden of fear that her companion might at once have declined even a consideration of her request, "indeed, sir, you will find that the trust which I would impose upon you is in appearance no such great matter as my words have led you to suppose. You must know that I am possessed of a little trinket, which, in the hands of anyone who like yourself is a stranger in these parts, would possess no significance, but which, while in my keeping, is fraught with infinite menace to me." Hereupon, and having so spoken, she clapped her hands, and an attendant immediately entered, disclosing the person of the same negress who had first introduced Jonathan into the strange adventure in which he now found himself involved. This creature, who appeared still more deformed and repulsive in the brilliantly lighted room than she had in the moonlight, carried in her hands a white napkin, which she handed to her mistress. This being opened, disclosed a small ivory ball of about the bigness of a lime. Nodding to the negress to withdraw, the lady handed him the ivory ball, and Jonathan took it with no small degree of curiosity and examined it carefully. It appeared to be of an exceeding antiquity, and of so deep a yellow as to be almost brown in color. It was covered over with strange figures and characters of an oriental sort, which appeared to our hero to be of Chinese workmanship. "I must tell you, sir," said the lady, after she had permitted her guest to examine this for a while in silence, "that though this appears to you to be of little worth, it is yet of extreme value. After all, however, it is nothing but a curiosity that anyone who is interested in such matters might possess. What I have to ask you is this: will you be willing to take this into your charge, to guard it with the utmost care and fidelity, yes, even as the apple of your eye, during your continuance in these parts, and to return it to me in safety the day before your departure? By so doing you will render me a service which you may neither understand nor comprehend, but which shall make me your debtor for my entire life." By this time Jonathan had pretty well composed his mind for a reply. "Friend," he said, "such a matter as this is entirely out of my knowledge of business, which is indeed that of a clerk in the mercantile profession. Nevertheless, I have every inclination to help thee, though I trust thou mayest have magnified the dangers that beset thee. This appears to me to be a little trifle for such an ado. Nevertheless, I will do as thou dost request. I will keep it in safety, and will return it to thee upon this day a week hence, by which time I hope to have discharged my cargo and be ready to continue my voyage to Demerara." At these words the lady, who had been watching him all the time with a most unaccountable eagerness, burst forth into words of such heartfelt gratitude as to entirely overwhelm our hero. When her transports had been somewhat assuaged, she permitted him to depart, and the negress conducted him back through the garden, whence she presently showed him through the gate whither he had entered and out into the street. That's the end of section 17, part 1 of the Ruby of Kishmoor. Section 18 of Howard Pyle's Book of Pirates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Schneider. Howard Pyle's Book of Pirates by Howard Pyle. Compiled by Merle Johnson. The Ruby of Kishmoor, Part 2. The Terrific Encounter with the One-Eyed Little Gentleman in Black. Finding himself once more in the open street, Jonathan Rugg stood for a while in the moonlight, endeavoring to compose his mind into somewhat of that sobriety that was habitual with him. For indeed he was not a little excited by the unexpected incidents that had just befallen him. From this effort at composure he was aroused by observing that a little gentleman clad all in black had stopped a little distance away, and was looking very intently at him. In the brightness of the moonlight our hero could see that the little gentleman possessed but a single eye, and that he carried a gold-headed cane in his hand. He had hardly time to observe these particulars when the other approached him with every appearance of politeness and cordiality. "Sir," said he, "surely I am not mistaken in recognizing in you the supercargo of the ship Susanna Hayes, which arrived this afternoon at this port?" "Indeed," said Jonathan, "thou art right, friend. That is my occupation, and that is whence I came." "To be sure," said the little gentleman, "to be sure, the Susanna Hayes, with a cargo of Indian corn meal, and from my dear good friend Jeremiah Doolittle, of Philadelphia. I know your good master very well indeed. And have you never heard him speak of his friend, Mr. Abner Greenway, of Kingston, Jamaica?" "Why, no," replied Jonathan, "I have no such recollection of the name, nor do I know that any such name hath ever appeared upon our books." To be sure," repeated the little gentleman briskly, and with exceeding good nature. "Indeed, my name is not likely to have appeared upon your employer's books, for I am not a business correspondent, but one who, in times past, was his extremely intimate friend. There is much I would like to ask about him, and indeed I was in hopes that you would have been the bearer of a letter from him. But I have lodgings at a little distance from here, that is, if it is not requesting too much of you, maybe you would accompany me thither, so that we may talk at our leisure." I would gladly accompany you to your ship, instead of urging you to come to my apartments, but I must tell you I am possessed of a devil of a fever, so that my physician has forbidden me to go out at nights." "Indeed," said Jonathan, who, you may have observed, was of very easy disposition. "Indeed, I shall be very glad to accompany thee to thy lodgings. There is nothing I would like better than to serve any friend of good Jeremiah Doolittle's." And thereupon, with great amity, the two walked off together, the little one-eyed gentleman in black linking his arm confidingly into that of Jonathan's, and tapping the pavement continually with his cane as he trotted on at a great pace. He was very well acquainted with the town, of which he was a citizen, and so interesting was his discourse that they had gone a considerable distance before Jonathan observed that they were entering into a quarter darker and less frequented than that which they had quitted. Tall brick houses stood upon either side, between which stretched a narrow, crooked roadway, with a kennel running down the center. In front of one of these houses, a tall and gloomy structure, our hero's conductor stopped, and opening the door with a key, beckoned for him to enter. Jonathan having complied, his new-found friend led the way up a flight of stairs, against which Jonathan's feet beat noisily in the darkness, and at length, having ascended 2 stairways, and having reached a landing, he opened a door at the end of the passage, and ushered Jonathan into an apartment, unlighted except for the moonshine, which, coming in through a partly open shutter, lay in a brilliant patch of light upon the floor. His conductor having struck a light with a flint and steel, our hero, by the illumination of a single candle, presently discovered himself to be in a bedchamber, furnished with no small degree of comfort and even elegance, and having every appearance of a bachelor's chamber. "You will pardon me," said his new acquaintance, "if I shut these shutters and the window, for that devilish fever of which I spoke is of such a sort that I must keep the night air even out of my room, or else I shall be shaking the bones out of my joints and chattering the teeth out of my head by tomorrow morning." So saying, he was as good as his word, and not only drew the shutters to, but shot the heavy iron bolt into its place. Having accomplished this, he bade our hero to be seated, and placing before him some exceedingly superior rum, together with some equally excellent tobacco, they presently fell into the friendliest discourse imaginable. In the course of their talk, which after a while became exceedingly confidential, Jonathan confided to his new friend the circumstances of the adventure into which he had been led by the beautiful stranger, and to all that he said concerning his adventure his interlocutor listened with the closest and most scrupulously riveted attention. "Upon my word," said he, when Jonathan had concluded, "I hope that you may not have been the victim of some foolish hoax. Let me see what she has confided to you." "That I will," replied Jonathan, and thereupon he thrust his hand into his breeches pocket and brought forth the ivory ball. No sooner did the one eye of the little gentleman in black light upon the object than a most singular and extraordinary convulsion appeared to seize upon him. Had a bullet penetrated his heart, he would not have started more violently, nor have sat more rigidly and breathlessly staring. Mastering his emotion with the utmost difficulty, as Jonathan replaced the ball in his pocket, he drew a deep and profound breath, and wiped the palm of his hand across his forehead, as though arousing himself from a dream. "And you," he said of a sudden, "are, I understand, a Quaker. Do you, then, never carry a weapon, even in such a place as this, where at any moment in the dark a Spanish knife may be stuck betwixt your ribs?" "Why, no," said Jonathan, somewhat surprised that so foreign a topic should have been so suddenly introduced into the discourse. "I am a man of peace, and not of blood. The people of the Society of Friends never carry weapons, either offense or defense." As Jonathan concluded his reply, the little gentleman suddenly arose from his chair and moved briskly around to the other side of the room. Our hero, watching him with some surprise, beheld him clap to the door, and with a single movement shoot the bolt and turn the key therein. The next instant he turned to Jonathan, a visage transformed as suddenly as though he had dropped a mask from his face. The gossiping and polite little old bachelor was there no longer, but in his stead a man with a countenance convulsed with some furious and nameless passion. "The ball!" he said, in a coarse and raucous voice. "That ivory ball! Get it to me upon the instant!" As he spoke he whipped out from his bosom a long, keen Spanish knife, that in its every appearance spoke without equivocation of the most murderous possibilities. The malignant passions that distorted every lineament of the countenance of this little old gentleman in black filled our hero with such astonishment that he knew not whether he were asleep or awake. But when he beheld the other advancing with the naked and shining knife in his hand, his reason returned to him like a flash. Leaping to his feet, he lost no time in putting the table between him and his sudden enemy. "Indeed, friend," he cried, in a voice penetrated with terror, "indeed, friend, thou hadst best keep thy distance from me, for though I am a man of peace and a shunner of bloodshed, I promise thee that I will not stand still to be murdered without outcry or without endeavoring to defend my life." "Cry as loud as you please," exclaimed the other. "No one is near this place to hear you. Cry until you are hoarse. No one in this neighborhood will stop to ask what is the matter with you. I tell you I am determined to possess myself of that ivory ball, and have it I shall, even though I am obliged to cut your heart to get it." As he spoke he grinned with so extraordinary and devilish a distortion of his countenance, and with such an appearance of every intention of carrying out his threat, as to send the goose flesh creeping like icy fingers up and down our hero's spine with the most incredible rapidity and acuteness. Nevertheless, mastering his fears, Jonathan contrived to speak up with a pretty good appearance of spirit. "Indeed, friend," he said, "thou appearest to forget that I am a man of twice thy bulk and half thy years, and that though thou hast a knife, I am determined to defend myself to the last extremity. I am not going to give thee that which thou demandest of me, and for thy sake I advise thee to open the door and let me go free as I entered, or else harm may befall thee." "Fool!" cried the other, hardly giving him time to end. "Do you then think that I have time to chatter with you while two villains are lying in wait for me, perhaps at the very door? Blame your own self for your death." And gnashing his teeth with an indescribable menace, and resting his hand upon the table, he vaulted with incredible agility clean across it and upon our hero, who, entirely unprepared for such an extraordinary attack, was flung back against the wall, with an arm as strong as steel clutching his throat, and a knife flashing in his very eyes with determined portent of instant death. With an instinct to preserve his life, he caught his assailant by the wrist, and bending it away from him, set every fiber of his body in a superhuman effort to guard and protect himself. The other, though so much older and smaller, seemed to be composed entirely of fibers of steel, and in his murderous endeavors put forth a strength so extraordinary that for a moment our hero felt his heart melt within him with terror for his life. The spittle appeared to dry up within his mouth, and his hair to creep and rise upon his head. With a vehement cry of despair and anguish he put forth one stupendous effort for defense, and clapping his heel behind the other's leg, and throwing his whole weight forward, he fairly tripped his antagonist backward as he stood. Together they fell upon the floor, locked in the most desperate embrace, and overturning a chair with a prodigious clatter in their descent, our hero upon the top, and the little gentleman in black beneath him. As they struck the floor, the little man in black emitted a most piercing and terrible scream, and instantly relaxing his efforts of attack, fell to beating the floor with the back of his hands, and drubbing with his heels upon the rug in which he had become entangled. Our hero leaped to his feet, and with dilating eyes and expanding brain and swimming sight, stared down upon the other like one turned to a stone. He beheld instantly what had occurred, and that he had, without so intending, killed a fellow man. The knife, turned away from his own person, had in their fall been plunged into the bosom of the other, and he now lay quivering in the last throes of death. As Jonathan gazed, he beheld a thin red stream trickle out from the parted and grinning lips. He beheld the eyes turned inward. He beheld the eyelids contract. He beheld the figure stretch itself. He beheld it become still in death. The momentous adventure with the stranger with the silver earrings. So our hero stood stunned and bedazed, gazing down upon his victim, like a man turned into a stone. His brain appeared to him to expand like a bubble, the blood surged and hummed in his ears with every gigantic beat of his heart, his vision swam, and his trembling hands were bedewed with a cold and repugnant sweat. The dead figure upon the floor at his feet gazed at him with a wide glassy stare, and in the confusion of his mind it appeared to Jonathan that he was indeed a murderer. What monstrous thing was this that had befallen him who but a moment before had been so entirely innocent of the guilt of blood? What was he now to do in such an extremity as this, with his victim lying dead at his feet, a poniard in his heart? Who would believe him to be guiltless of crime with such a dreadful evidence as this presented against him? How was he, a stranger in a foreign land, to totally defend himself against an accusation of mistaken justice? At these thoughts a developed terror gripped at his vitals, and a sweat as cold as ice bedewed his entire body. No, he must tarry for no explanation or defense. He must immediately fly from this terrible place, or else, should he be discovered, his doom would certainly be sealed. At that moment, and in the very extremity of his apprehensions, there fell of a sudden a knock upon the door, sounding so loud and so startling upon the silence of the room that every shattered nerve in our hero's frame tingled and thrilled to answer to it. He stood petrified, scarcely so much as daring to breathe, and then, observing that his mouth was agape, he moistened his dry and parched lips and drew his jaws together with a snap. Again there fell the same loud, insistent knock upon the panel, followed by the imperative words, "Open within." The wretched Jonathan flung about him a glance at once of terror and of despair, but there was for him no possible escape. He was shut tight in the room with his dead victim, like a rat in a trap. Nothing remained for him but to obey the summons from without. Indeed, at the very extremity of his distraction, he possessed reason enough to perceive that the longer he delayed opening the door, the less innocent he might hope to appear in the eyes of whoever stood without. With the uncertain and spasmodic movements of an ill-constructed automaton, he crossed the room, and stepping very carefully over the prostrate body upon the floor, and with a hesitating reluctance that he could in no degree master, he unlocked, unbolted, and opened the door. The figure that outlined itself in the light of the candle against the blackness of the passageway without was of such a singular and foreign aspect as to fit extremely well into the extraordinary tragedy of which Jonathan was at once the victim and the cause. It was that of a lean, tall man, with a thin, yellow countenance, embellished with a long black mustache, and having a pair of forbidding, deeply set, and extremely restless black eyes. A crimson handkerchief beneath a lace-cocked hat was tied tightly around the head, and a pair of silver earrings, which caught the light of the candle, gleamed and twinkled against the inky darkness of the passageway beyond. This extraordinary being, without favoring our hero with any word of apology for his intrusion, immediately thrust himself forward into the room, and stretching his long, lean, bird-like neck so as to direct his gaze over the intervening table, fixed a gaping and concentrated stare upon the figure lying still and motionless in the center of the room. "What you do there?" he said, with a guttural and foreign accent, and thereupon, without waiting for a reply, came forward and knelt down beside the dead man. After thrusting his hand into the silent and shrunken bosom, he presently looked up and fixed his penetrating eyes upon our hero's countenance, who, benumbed and bedazed with his despair, still stood like one enchained in the bonds of a nightmare. "He was dead," said the stranger, and Jonathan nodded his head in reply. "Why you kill this man?" inquired his interlocutor. "Indeed!" Jonathan cried, finding a voice at last, but one so hoarse that he could scarcely recognize it for his own, "I know not what to make of the affair, but indeed I do assure thee, friend, that I am entirely innocent of what thou seest." The stranger still kept his piercing gaze fixed upon our hero's countenance, and Jonathan, feeling that something further was demanded of him, continued, "I am indeed a victim of a most extravagant and extraordinary adventure. This evening, coming an entire stranger to this country, I was introduced into the house of a beautiful female, who bestowed upon me a charge that appeared to me to be at once insignificant and absurd. 'Behold this little ivory ball,' said he, drawing the globe from his pocket and displaying it between his thumb and finger. 'It is this that appears to have brought all this disaster upon me; for, coming from the house of the young woman, the man thou now beholdest lying dead upon the floor induced me to come to this place. Having inveigled me hither, he demanded of me to give him at once this insignificant trifle. Upon my refusing to do so, he assaulted me with every appearance of a mad and furious inclination to deprive me of my life.'" At the sight of the ivory ball, the stranger quickly rose from his kneeling position, and fixed upon our hero a gaze the most extraordinary that he had ever encountered. His eyes dilated like those of a cat; the breath expelled itself from his bosom in so deep and profound an expiration that it appeared as though it might never return again. Nor was it until Jonathan had placed the ball in his pocket that he appeared to awaken from the trance that the sight of the object had sent him into. But no sooner had the cause of this strange demeanor disappeared into our hero's breeches pocket than he arose as with an electric shock. In an instant he became transformed as by a touch of magic. A sudden and baleful light flamed into his eyes, his face grew as red as blood, and he clapped his hands to his pockets with a sudden and violent motion. "The ball!" he cried in a hoarse and strident voice. "The ball! Give me the ball!" And upon the next instant our hero beheld the round and shining nozzle of a pistol pointed directly against his forehead. For a moment he stood as though transfixed; then, in the mortal peril that faced him, he uttered a roar that sounded in his own ears like the outcry of a wild beast, and thereupon flung himself bodily upon the other with the violence and the fury of a madman. The stranger drew the trigger, and the powder flashed in the pan. He dropped the weapon, clattering, and in an instant tried to draw another from his other pocket. Before he could direct his aim, however, our hero had caught him by both wrists, and, bending his hand backward, prevented the chance of any shot from taking immediate effect upon his person. Then followed a struggle of extraordinary ferocity and frenzy, the stranger endeavoring to free his hand, and Jonathan striving with all the energy of despair to prevent him from effecting his murderous purpose. In the struggle our hero became thrust against the edge of the table. He felt as though his back were breaking, and became conscious that in such a situation he could hope to defend himself only a few moments longer. The stranger's face was pressed close to his own; his hot breath, strong with the odor of garlic, fanned our hero's cheek, while his lips, distended into a ferocious and ferine grin, displayed his sharp teeth shining in the candlelight. "Give me the ball," he said, in a harsh and furious whisper. At that moment there rang in Jonathan's ears the sudden and astounding detonation of a pistol shot, and for a moment he wondered whether he had received a mortal wound without being aware of it. Then suddenly he beheld an extraordinary and dreadful transformation take place in the countenance thrust so close to his own. The eyes winked several times with incredible rapidity, and then rolled upward and inward. The jaws gaped into a dreadful and cavernous yawn. The pistol fell with a clatter to the floor, and the next moment the muscles, so rigid but an instant before, relaxed into a limp and listless flaccidity. The joints collapsed. The entire man fell into an indistinguishable heap upon and across the dead figure stretched out upon the floor, while at the same time a pungent and blinding cloud of gunpowder smoke filled the apartment. For a few moments the hands twitched convulsively, the neck stretched itself to an abominable length, the long, lean legs slowly and gradually relaxed, and every fiber of the body gradually collapsed into the lassitude of death. A spot of blood appeared and grew upon the collar at the throat, and in the same degree the color ebbed from the face, leaving it of a dull and leaden pallor. All these terrible and formidable changes of aspect our hero stood watching with a motionless and riveted attention, and as though they were to him matters of the utmost consequence and importance. And only when the last flicker of life had departed from his second victim did he lift his gaze from its terrible scene of dissolution to stare about him, this way and that, his eyes blinded and his breath stifled by the thick cloud of sulphurous smoke that obscured the objects about him in a pungent cloud. That is the end of Part 2 of The Ruby of Kishmoor. Section 19 of Howard Pyle's Book of Pirates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Schneider. Howard Pyle's Book of Pirates by Howard Pyle. Compiled by Merle Johnson. The Ruby of Kishmoor, Part 3. The unexpected encounter with the sea captain with the broken nose. If our hero had been distracted and bedazed by the first catastrophe that had befallen, this second and even more dreadful and violent occurrence appeared to take away from him for the moment every power of thought and of sensation. All that perturbation of emotion that had before convulsed him he discovered to have disappeared, and in its stead a benumbed and blinded intelligence alone remained to him. As he stood in the presence of this second death, of which he had been as innocent and as unwilling an instrument as he had of the first, he could observe no signs either of remorse or of horror within him. He picked up his hat, which had fallen upon the floor in the first encounter, and brushing away the dust with the cuff of his coat sleeve with extraordinary care, adjusted the beaver upon his head with the utmost nicety. Then turning, still stupefied as with the fumes of some powerful drug, he prepared to quit the scene of tragic terrors that had thus unexpectedly accumulated upon him. But ere he could put his design into execution, his ears were startled by the sound of loud and hurried footsteps, which, coming from below, ascended the stairs with a prodigious clatter and bustle of speed. At the landing these footsteps paused for a while, and then approached, more cautious and deliberate, toward the room where the double tragedy had been enacted, and where our hero yet stood silent and inert. All this while Jonathan made no endeavor to escape, but stood passive and submissive to what might occur. He felt himself the victim of circumstances over which he himself had no control. Gazing at the partly open door, he waited for whatever adventure might next befall him. Once again the footsteps paused, this time at the very threshold, and then the door was slowly pushed open from without. As our hero gazed at the aperture, there presently became disclosed to his view the strong and robust figure of one who was evidently of a seafaring habit. From the gold braid upon his hat, the seals dangling from the ribbons at his fob, and a certain particularity of custom, he was evidently of no small consideration in his profession. He was of a strong and powerful build, with a head set close to his shoulders, and upon a round, short bull neck. He wore a black cravat, loosely tied into a knot, and a red waistcoat, elaborately trimmed with gold braid. The leather belt with the brass buckle and hanger and huge sea boots completed a costume singularly suggestive of his occupation in life. His face was round and broad like that of a cat, and a complexion stained by constant exposure to sun and wind to a color of newly polished mahogany. But a countenance which otherwise might have been humorous, in this case was rendered singularly repulsive by the fact that his nose had been broken so flat to his face that all that remained to distinguish that feature were two circular orifices where the nostrils should have been. His eyes were by no means so sinister as the rest of his visage, being of a light gray color and exceedingly vivacious, even good-natured in the merry restlessness of their glance, albeit they were well nigh hidden beneath a black bush of overhanging eyebrows. When he spoke, his voice was so deep and resonant that it was as though it issued from a barrel rather than from the breast of a human being. "How now, me hearty?" cried he, in stentorian tones, so loud that they seemed to stun the tensely drawn drums of our hero's ears. "How now, me hearty? What's to do here? Who is shooting pistols at this hour of the night?" Then, catching sight of the figures lying in a huddle upon the floor, his great thick lips parted into a gape of wonder, and his gray eyes rolled in his head like two balls, so that what with his flat face and the round holes of his nostrils, he presented an appearance which, under other circumstances, would have been at once ludicrous and grotesque. "By the blood!" cried he, "to be sure it is murder that has happened here." "Not murder!" cried Jonathan, in a shrill and panting voice. "Not murder! It was an accident, and I am as innocent as a baby." The newcomer looked at him, and then at the two figures upon the floor, and then back at him again, with eyes at once quizzical and cunning. Then his face broke into a grin that might hardly be called a drollery. "Accident!" quoth he. "By the blood! D'ye see 'tis a strange accident indeed that lays two men by the heels and lets the third go without a scratch." Delivering himself thus, he came forward into the room, and taking the last victim of Jonathan's adventure by the arm, with as little compunction as he would have handled a sack of grain, he dragged the limp and helpless figure from where it lay to the floor beside the first victim. Then, lifting the lighted candle, he bent over the two prostrate bodies, holding the illumination close to the lineaments, first of one and then of the other. He looked at them very carefully for a long while, with the closest and most intent scrutiny, and in perfect silence. "They are both dead," says he, "as Davy Jones, and whoever you be, I protest that you have done your business the most completest that I ever saw in all my life." "Indeed," cried Jonathan, in the same shrill and panting voice, "it was themselves who did it. First one of them attacked me, and then the other, and I did but try to keep them from murdering me. This one fell on his knife, and that one shot himself in his efforts to destroy me." "That," said the seaman, "you may very well tell to a drylander, and maybe he will believe you. But you cannot so easily pull the wool over the eyes of Captain Benny Willets. And what, if I may be so bold as for to ask you, was the reason for their attacking so harmless a man as you proclaim yourself to be?" "That I know not," cried Jonathan. "I am entirely willing to tell thee all the circumstances. Thou must know that I am a member of the Society of Friends. This day I landed here in Kingston, and met a young woman of very comely appearance, who entrusted me with a little ivory ball, which she requested me to keep for her a few days. The sight of this ball, in which I can detect nothing that could be likely to arouse any feelings of violence, appears to have driven these two men entirely mad, so that they instantly made the most ferocious and murderous assault upon me. See, wouldst thou have believed that so small a thing as this would have caused so much trouble?" And as he spoke he held up to the gaze of the other the cause of the double tragedy that had befallen. But no sooner had Captain Willets's eyes lighted upon the ball than the most singular change passed over his countenance. The color appeared to grow dull and yellow in his ruddy cheeks, his fat lips dropped apart, and his eyes stared with a fixed and glassy glare. He arose to his feet, and still with the expression of astonishment and wonder upon his face, gazed first at our hero and then at the ivory ball in his hands, as though he were deprived both of reason and of speech. At last, as our hero slipped the trifle back in his pocket again, the mariner slowly recovered himself, though with a prodigious effort, and drew a deep and profound breath as to the very bottom of his lungs. He wiped with the corner of his black silk cravat his brow, upon which the sweat appeared to have gathered. "Well, messmate," says he at last, with a sudden change of voice, "you have indeed had a most wonderful adventure." Then, with another deep breath, "Well, by the blood, I may tell you plainly that I am no poor hand at the reading of faces. Well, I think you to be honest, and I am inclined to believe every word you tell me. By the blood, I am prodigiously sorry for you, and I am inclined to help you out of your scrape. The first thing to do," he continued, "is to get rid of these two dead men, and that is an affair I believe we shall have no trouble in handling. One of them we will wrap up in the carpet there, and t'other we can roll into yonder bed curtain. You shall carry the one, and I the other, and the harbor being at no great distance, we can easily bring them thither, and tumble them overboard, and no one will be the wiser of what has happened. For your own safety, you may easily see you can hardly go away and leave these objects here to be found by the first comer, and to rise up in evidence against you." This reasoning, in our hero's present bewildered state, appeared to him to be so extremely just that he raised not the least objection to it. Accordingly, each of the two silent, voiceless victims of the evening's occurrences was wrapped into a bundle that from without appeared to be neither portentous nor terrible in appearance. Thereupon Jonathan, shouldering the rug containing the little gentleman in black, and the sea captain doing the like for the other, they presently made their way down the stairs through the darkness, and so out into the street. Here the sea captain became the conductor of the expedition, and leading the way down several alleys and along certain by-streets, now and then stopping to rest, for the burdens were both heavy and clumsy to carry, they both came out at last to the harbor front, without any one having questioned them or having appeared to suspect them of anything wrong. At the water side was an open wharf, extending a pretty good distance out into the harbor. Thither the captain led the way, and Jonathan followed. So they made their way out along the wharf or pier, stumbling now and then over loose boards, until they came at last to where the water was of a sufficient depth for their purpose. Here the captain, bending his shoulders, shot his burden out into the dark, mysterious waters, and Jonathan, following his example, did the same. Each body sank with a sullen and leaden splash into the element, where the casings which swathed them becoming loosened, the rug and the curtain rose to the surface and drifted slowly away with the tide. As Jonathan stood gazing dully at the disappearance of these last evidences of his two inadvertent murders, he was suddenly and vehemently aroused by feeling a pair of arms of enormous strength flung about him from behind. In their embrace his elbows were instantly pinned tight to his side, and he stood for a moment helpless and astounded, while the voice of the sea captain, rumbling in his ear, exclaimed, "Ye bloody mother and Quaker, I'll have that ivory ball, or I'll have your life." These words produced the same effect upon Jonathan as though a douche of cold water had suddenly been flung over him. He began instantly to struggle to free himself, and that with a frantic and vehement violence begotten at once of terror and despair. So prodigious were his efforts that more than once he had nearly torn himself free, but still the powerful arms of his captor held him as in a vise of iron. Meantime our hero's assailant made frequent though ineffectual attempts to thrust a hand into the breeches pocket where the ivory ball was hidden, swearing the while under his breath with a terrifying and monstrous string of oaths. At last, finding himself foiled in every such attempt, and losing all patience at the struggles of his victim, he endeavored to lift Jonathan off of his feet, as though to dash him bodily upon the ground. In this he would doubtless have succeeded, had he not caught his heel in the crack of a loose board on the wharf. Instantly they both fell, violently prostrate, the captain beneath and Jonathan above him, though still encircled in his iron embrace. Our hero felt the back of his head strike violently upon the flat face of the other, and he heard the captain's skull sound with a terrific crack, like that of a breaking egg upon some post or billet of wood against which he must have struck. In their frantic struggles they had approached extremely near the edge of the wharf, so that the next instant, with an enormous and thunderous splash, Jonathan found himself plunged into the waters of the harbor, and the arms of his assailant loosened from about his body. The shock of the water brought him instantly to his senses, and being a fairly good swimmer he had not the least difficulty in reaching and clutching the crosspiece of a wooden ladder that, coated with slimy sea moss, led from the water level to the wharf above. After reaching the safety of the dry land once more, Jonathan gazed about him as though to discern whence the next attack might be delivered upon him. But he stood entirely alone upon the deck. Not another living soul was in sight. The surface of the water exhibited some commotion, as though disturbed by something struggling beneath. But the sea captain, who had doubtless been stunned by the tremendous crack upon his head, never arose again out of the element that had engulfed him. The moonlight shone with a peaceful and resplendent illumination, and excepting certain remote noises from the distant town, not a sound broke the silence and peacefulness of the balmy tropical night. The limpid water, illuminated by the resplendent moonlight, lapped against the wharf. All the world was calm, serene, and enveloped in a profound and entire repose. Jonathan looked up at the round and brilliant globe of light floating in the sky above his head, and wondered whether it were indeed possible that all that had befallen him was a reality, and not some tremendous hallucination. Then, suddenly arousing himself to a renewed realization of that which had occurred, he turned and ran like one possessed, up along the wharf, and so into the moonlit town once more. The conclusion of the adventure with the lady with the silver veil. Nor did he check his precipitous flight until suddenly, being led perhaps by some strange influence of which he was not at all the master, he discovered himself to be standing before the garden gate, where not more than an hour before he had first entered upon the series of monstrous adventures that had led to such tremendous conclusions. People were still passing and repassing, and one of these groups, a party of young ladies and gentlemen, paused upon the opposite side of the street to observe, with no small curiosity and amusement, his dripping and bedraggled aspect. But only one thought and one intention possessed our hero: to relieve himself as quickly as possible of that trust which he had taken up so thoughtlessly, and with such monstrous results to himself and to his victims. He ran to the gate of the garden and began beating and kicking upon it with a vehemence that he could neither master nor control. He was aware that the entire neighborhood was becoming aroused, for he beheld lights moving and loud voices of inquiry. Yet he gave not the least thought to the disturbance he was creating, but continued without intermission his uproarious pounding upon the gate. At length, in answer to the sound of his vehement blows, the little wicket was opened, and a pair of eyes appeared thereat. The next instant the gate was cast ajar very hastily, and the pock-pitted negress appeared. She caught him by the sleeve of his coat and drew him quickly into the garden. "Buckra, Buckra!" she cried. "What you doin'? You wake the whole town." Then, observing his dripping garments, "You been in the water. You catch fever and shake till you die." "Thy mistress!" cried Jonathan, almost sobbing in the excess of his emotion. "Take me to her upon the instant, or I cannot answer for my not going entirely mad." When our hero was again introduced to the lady, he found her clad in a loose and elegant negligee, infinitely becoming to her graceful figure, and still covered with the veil of silver gauze that had before enveloped her. "Friend," he cried vehemently, approaching her, and holding out toward her the little ivory ball, "take again this which thou gavest me. It has brought death to 3 men, and I know not what terrible fate may befall me if I keep it longer in my possession." "What is it you say?" cried she in a piercing voice. "Did you say it hath caused the death of 3 men? Quick, Tell me what has happened, for I feel somehow a presage that you bring me news of safety and release from all my dangers." "I know not what thou meanest," cried Jonathan, still panting with agitation. "But this I do know, that when I went away from thee I departed an innocent man, and now I come back to thee burdened with the weight of 3 lives, which, though innocent, I have been instrumental in taking." "Explain!" exclaimed the woman, tapping the floor with her foot. "Explain! Explain!" "That I will," cried Jonathan, "and as soon as I am able. When I left thee and went out into the street I was accosted by a little gentleman clad in black." "Indeed!" cried the lady. "And had he but one eye? And did he carry a gold-headed cane?" "Exactly," said Jonathan. "And he claimed acquaintance with friend Jeremiah Doolittle." "He never knew him," cried the lady, vehemently. "And I must tell you that he was a villain named Hunt, who at one time was the intimate consort of the pirate Kite. He it was who plunged a deadly knife into his captain's bosom, and so murdered him in this very house. He himself or his agents must have been watching my gate when you went forth." "I know not how that may be," said Jonathan, "but he took me to his apartment, and there, obtaining a knowledge of the trust thou didst burden me with, he demanded it of me, and upon my refusing to deliver it to him, he presently fell to attacking me with a dagger. In my efforts to protect my life I inadvertently caused him to plunge the knife into his own bosom and to kill himself." "And what then?" cried the lady, who appeared well nigh distracted with her emotions. "Then," said Jonathan, "there was a strange man, a foreigner, who upon his part assaulted me with a pistol, with every intention of murdering me and thus obtaining possession of that same little trifle." "And did he," exclaimed the lady, "have long black mustachios? And did he have silver earrings in his ears?" "Yes," said Jonathan, "he did." "That," cried the lady, "would have been none other than Captain Kite's Portuguese sailing master, who must have been spying upon Hunt. Tell me what happened next." "He would have taken my life," said Jonathan, "but in the struggle that followed he shot himself accidentally with his own pistol and died at my very feet. I do not know what would have happened to me if a sea captain had not come and proffered his assistance." "A sea captain? And had he a flat face and a broken nose?" "Indeed he had," replied Jonathan. "That," said the lady, "must have been Captain Kite's pirate friend, Captain Willets of the Bloody Hand. He was doubtless spying upon the Portuguese." "He induced me," said Jonathan, "to carry the 2 bodies down to the wharf. Having inveigled me there, where I suppose he thought no one could interfere, he assaulted me and endeavored to take the ivory ball away from me. In my efforts to escape we both fell into the water, and he, striking his head upon the edge of the wharf, was first stunned and then drowned." "Thank God!" cried the lady, with a transport of fervor, and clasping her jeweled hands together. "At last I am free of those who have heretofore persecuted me and threatened my very life itself. You have asked to behold my face. I will now show it to you. Heretofore I have been obliged to keep it concealed, lest, recognizing me, my enemies would have slain me." As she spoke, she drew aside her veil and disclosed to the vision of our hero a countenance of the most extraordinary and striking beauty. Her luminous eyes were like those of a Jawa, and set beneath exquisitely arched and penciled brows. Her forehead was like lustrous ivory, and her lips like rose leaves. Her hair, which was as smooth as the finest silk, was fastened up in masses of ravishing abundance. "I am," said she, "the daughter of that unfortunate Captain Kite, who, though weak and a pirate, was not so wicked, I would have you know, as he has been painted. He would doubtless have been an honest man had he not been led astray by the villain Hunt, who so nearly compassed your destruction. He returned to this island before his death, and made me the sole heir of all that great fortune which he had gathered, perhaps not by the most honest means, in the waters of the Indian Ocean. But the greatest treasure of all that fortune bequeathed to me was a single jewel which you yourself have just now defended with a courage and a fidelity that I cannot sufficiently extol. It is that priceless gem known as the ruby of Kishmoor. I will show it to you." Hereupon she took the little ivory ball in her hand, and with a turn of her beautiful wrists unscrewed a lid so nicely and cunningly adjusted that no eye could have detected where it was joined to the parent globe. Within was a fleece of raw silk containing an object which she presently displayed before the astonished gaze of our hero. It was a red stone of about the bigness of a plover's egg, and which glowed and flamed with such an exquisite and ruddy brilliancy as to dazzle even Jonathan's inexperienced eyes. Indeed, he did not need to be informed of the priceless value of the treasure which he beheld in the rosy palm extended toward him. How long he gazed at this extraordinary jewel he knew not, but he was aroused from his contemplation by the sound of the lady's voice addressing him. "The three villains," said she, "who have this day met their deserts in a violent and bloody death, had by an accident obtained knowledge that this jewel was in my possession. Since then my life has hung upon a thread, and every step that I have taken has been watched by these enemies, the most cruel and relentless that it was ever the lot of any unfortunate to possess. From the mortal dangers of their machinations you have saved me, exhibited a courage and a determination that cannot be sufficiently applauded. In this you have earned my deepest admiration and regard. I would rather," she cried, "entrust my life and my happiness to you than into the keeping of any man whom I have ever met. I cannot hope to reward you in such a way as to recompense you for the perils into which my necessities have thrust you, but yet," and here she hesitated, as though seeking for words in which to express herself, "but yet, if you are willing to accept of this jewel, and all of the fortune that belongs to me, together with the person of poor Eveline Kite herself, not only the stone and the wealth, but the woman also, are yours to dispose of as you see fit." Our hero was so struck aback at this unexpected turn that he knew not upon the instant what reply to make. "Friend," said he at last, "I thank thee extremely for thy offer, and though I would not be ungracious, it is yet borne in upon me to testify to thee that as to the stone itself and the fortune of which thou speakest, and of which I very well know the history, I have no inclination to receive either the one or the other, both the fruits of theft, rapine, and murder. The jewel I have myself beheld 3 times stained, as it were, with the blood of my fellow man, so that it now has so little value in my sight that I would not give a peppercorn to possess it. Indeed, there is no inducement in the world that could persuade me to accept it, or even to take it again into my hand. As to the rest of thy generous offer, I have only to say that I am 4 months hence to be married to a very comely young woman in Kensington, in Pennsylvania, by name Martha Dobbs, and therefore I am not at liberty to consider my inclinations in any other direction." Having so delivered himself, Jonathan bowed with such ease as his stiff and awkward joints might command, and thereupon withdrew from the presence of the charmer, who, with cheeks suffused with blushes and with eyes averted, made no endeavor to detain him. So ended the only adventure of moment that ever happened him in all his life, for thereafter he contented himself with such excitement as his mercantile profession and his extremely peaceful existence might afford. Epilogue. In conclusion, it may be said that when the worthy Jonathan Rugg was married to Martha Dobbs, upon the following June, some mysterious friend presented to the bride a rope of pearls of such considerable value that when they were realized into money our hero was enabled to enter into partnership with his former patron, the worthy Jeremiah Doolittle, and that having made such a beginning, he by and by arose to become in his day one of the leading merchants of his native town of Philadelphia. That is the end of Part 3 of The Ruby of Kishmoor. And that is the end of Howard Pyle's Book of Pirates.